Was it the chill draught that snaked through the ill-fitting window frame, or the persistent gnawing in her own mind that pulled Elara Vance from her slumber? The sliver of pre-dawn London light, grey and grudging, did little to illuminate the cramped attic room, but she knew its every contour by heart. The precarious stacks of vellum scrolls, the faint, ever-present scent of dried ink and old tallow, the cold comfort of the worn wooden desk where her true life unfolded. Downstairs, the Vance household, respectable mercers of Cheapside, would soon stir, expecting Elara at 28 to be contemplating advantageous marriages or, at the very least, the day's embroidery. They would not expect her to have spent half the night wrestling with the hydrodynamics of tidal mills, her fingers smudged with charcoal, her mind alight with gears and livers. A particularly vexing problem concerning the new flood defences proposed for the Southwark bank of the Thames had been her tormentor. The official plans, overseen by the ageing Master Alistair Finch of the Engineers Guild, were, in Elara's meticulously calculated opinion, woefully inadequate, expensive, slow to construct, and unlikely to withstand the ferocity of a proper spring tide surge. She had diagrams hidden beneath a false bottom in her sewing box that proved it. Diagrams that showed a more elegant, more robust solution, a series of interconnected, counterweighted sluice gates that could adapt to the river's variable moods. Diagrams no one in authority would ever deign to look at were they to know their author was a woman. A familiar ache settled in Elara's chest, a compound of frustration and a fierce, almost painful, intellectual hunger. It had been this way since she was a girl, taking apart her father's prized German clock, not out of malice, but an insatiable need to understand its intricate heart. Her father, a kind man more interested in ledgers than mechanics, had sighed, but there had been a flicker of something. Pride, bewilderment, in his eyes when she'd reassembled it perfectly. That flicker had been a small, guarded flame she'd nurtured in secret ever since. Her mother, Lady Agnes, saw only wilfulness, a daughter who preferred Euclid to etiquette, a worrying anomaly in the prescribed order of things. The memory of the Southwark plans prodded her. The city deserved better. She could offer better, but how? The guilds were fortresses of male prerogative, the city council's echo chambers of established, often ossified, male voices. To even suggest a sudden, sharp rapping at the street door below shattered the quiet. Too early for deliveries, too urgent for a social call. Elara tucked a stray strand of dark, unruly hair behind her ear, her mind already shifting, assessing. Trouble in London often announced itself with such abruptness. She crept to her small window, peering down. Two men, cloaked against the morning chill, stood at their door. One, by his bearing, was a city watchman. The other looked like trouble itself, or at least its harbinger. This was the London of 1488. A city of burgeoning trade and ancient anxieties, ruled by the shrewd, newly established Tudor king Henry VII, who valued stability and full coffers above all else. It was a city of opportunity for some, a cage of convention for others. For Elara Vance it was both, a place whose pressing, practical problems she yearned to solve, and a society that would, if it knew the true scope of her ambitions, likely brand her a meddler or worse. The rapping came again, more insistent now. Her father's voice, thick with sleep, rumbled from below. Elara held her breath, a premonition, cold and sharp as the morning air, settling upon her. The gnawing in her mind had found an echo in the world outside. Current part characters, 4,000. Total characters, 4,000. Her father, Master Thomas Vance, a man whose comfortable girth spoke of prosperous trade in wool and Flemish cloth, descended the narrow stairs, his nightshirt hastily tucked into his breeches. Elara, listening from the landing above, heard the scrape of the bolt and then the low murmur of voices. One was deferential, the other clipped and authoritative. She couldn't make out the words, only the unsettling cadence. After a few minutes the door closed and her father slowly climbed back up, his face etched with a worry that sat ill on his usually placid features. He found Elara lingering by her attic door. "Daughter," he said, his voice hushed. "There's an unfortunate matter. Master Alistair Finch of the Engineers Guild. He was found dead this morning in his workshop by the river. An accident, they say. A beam collapsed." Elara felt a strange stillness descend. Master Finch. the architect of the flawed Southwark defences, a man whose work she had mentally dismantled and reassembled 100 times. An accident? She repeated, her mind racing. Workshops were dangerous places, yes, but Finch was known for his caution, almost to a fault. "So the watch believes," her father said, though a shadow of doubt flickered in his eyes. "But the Lord Mayor himself has sent word. There are complications. Master Finch was overseeing the King's new works at the Tower, some minor repairs to the Watergate, but sensitive nonetheless. His Majesty will want no delays, no hint of incompetence or worse." He paused, looking directly at Ilara, a rare intensity in his gaze. "They will need someone to assess Finch's plans, to ensure continuity. The Guild will propose a successor, of course, but the Council, they sometimes seek external counsel on matters of urgency." Ilara understood the unspoken current. Her father, in his quiet way, knew something of her hobby. He'd seen her diagrams for a more efficient wool press, a suggestion she'd artfully allowed a junior guild member to discover. He never spoke of it directly, but he hadn't forbidden her pursuits either, a silent complicity that was both a comfort and a source of guilt for Ilara, who knew the risks he ran by not curtailing her unladylike interests. "The Guild will resist any outsider," Ilara said, more to herself than to him. Tradition was their bulwark. "Perhaps," her father conceded. "But Finch's workshop, it is to be sealed until a full inventory. His plans, his models, they are vital." He hesitated. "Lord Ashworth is on the committee overseeing the Tower works. He is a man open to new ideas if they are presented with discretion and promise advantage." Lord Ashworth. Ilara knew the name. A younger nobleman, ambitious, with a reputation for a keen eye for talent and a certain pragmatism that sometimes skirted the edges of convention. He was also known to have invested, albeit discreetly, in several ventures that employed novel, if unproven, technologies. "What are you suggesting, father?" Ilara asked, though a thrilling, terrifying idea was already taking root. "I am suggesting nothing, daughter," Thomas Vance said, his gaze dropping to the ink stain on her finger, a tiny dark star against her skin. "Only that London is a city of currents, seen and unseen, and sometimes a skilled navigator can use even a tragic tide to her advantage." He patted her arm, a gesture of awkward affection. "See to your mother. She will be distressed by the news." He left her then, descending to the mercer's life that was his public face. Ilara stood at her attic door, the chill of the morning forgotten, replaced by a burning current of her own. Finch was dead. His plans, his flawed, inadequate plans for Southwark, for the Tower, were now in limbo. An opportunity, cloaked in tragedy, but how to grasp it? Lord Ashworth. He was a potential conduit, but one she could not approach directly. She needed an intermediary, someone with standing, someone whose voice would be heard where hers would be silenced. Her mind immediately went to Master Elias Thorne. Once a celebrated horologist and maker of intricate astronomical devices, Thorne had fallen from grace years ago. A grand public clock he'd designed for Cornhill had suffered a catastrophic and very public failure, ruining his reputation and bankrupting his patrons. He now lived in reclusive semi-poverty, his genius dismissed as folly, his workshop in a forgotten alley near the Cripplegate, a place of dust and broken dreams. Ilara had sought him out a year prior, drawn by whispers of his past brilliance. She'd found a man embittered and suspicious, but whose eyes still lit with a fierce intelligence when she'd dared to discuss the mathematics of escapement mechanisms. He had, after much persuasion, grudgingly allowed her access to his collection of rare treatises on mechanics, a treasure trove of forgotten knowledge. He was her only link to the world of practical engineering, however tenuous. Could she persuade Master Thorne? Could his tarnished name, ironically, provide the cover her own gender denied her? The thought was audacious, perilous, but the image of those flawed Southwark defences, of a London vulnerable, spurred her on. The ink stain on her finger seemed to throb. It was not just a mark of her secret passion, it was a call to action. The alley leading to Master Thorne's workshop was a narrow, malodorous passage, squeezed between a tannery and a crumbling tenement. Even in the brighter light of mid-morning it retained a perpetual gloom. Ilara pulled her modest cloak tighter, her basket, ostensibly filled with mending for a distant, impoverished relative, held firmly in her hand. Beneath the linen and thread lay her carefully rendered diagrams for the Southwark gates and a new, more robust design for the tower's watergate mechanism, based on what little she knew of Finch's project. Thorne's door was a slab of weathered oak, paint peeling, a single iron knocker shaped like a morose gargoyle. She hesitated for a moment, the familiar cocktail of hope and trepidation churning within her. Thorne was a volatile quantity. Some days he was receptive, his mind sharp and engaging. Others he was lost in a fog of cynicism, railing against the ignorance of guilds and the fickleness of patrons. She knocked. Silence. She knocked again, louder. A series of metallic cling scrapes echoed from within, followed by a shuffling sound. The door creaked open a few inches, revealing a sliver of Master Thorne's face, a suspicious eye, a wild corona of grey hair, the scent of old oil and something vaguely metallic. "Mistress Vance," he rasped, his voice like unoiled gears. "To what do I owe this interruption?" His tone was not welcoming. "Master Thorne," Alara began, keeping her voice even, respectful, "I come on a matter of some urgency, and perhaps opportunity." He grunted, but the door opened a fraction wider. "Opportunity has long since passed me by, girl. It now consorts with fools and charlatans." Yet he didn't close the door. Curiosity, Alara knew, was the one vice Thorne had never managed to conquer. "Master Finch is dead," she said quietly. Thorne's visible eye widened almost imperceptibly. "Finch? Old Safety First Finch? How?" "An accident in his workshop, they say. A collapsed beam." A dry, humorless chuckle escaped Thorne. The irony. The man spent his life over-engineering every hinge and scaffold, only to be undone by his own timber. Or perhaps, his voice dropped, a sly note entering it, the timber had assistance. Alara chose to ignore the insinuation. "His death leaves a void, Master Thorne. Particularly with the King's works at the tower and the Southwark defences still so contentious." "Contentious because they are idiotic," Thorne snapped, his earlier lethargy vanishing. "Finch's designs for those sluices wouldn't hold back a determined duck, let alone the Thames in full flood." He peered at her more closely. "And what concern is this of yours, Mistress Vance? More theoretical exercises to clutter your pretty head?" The barb stung, as it always did, but Alara kept her composure. This was the dance she always had to perform with him. "I have some thoughts, revisions, based on sound principles." She lifted her basket slightly. "And I believe, Master Thorne, that with your experience and standing, these thoughts might find an ear where mine cannot." He was silent for a long moment, his eye boring into her. Then, with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of years of disappointment, he pulled the door fully open. "Come in, then, but do not expect miracles. The guilds are jackals, and the council is a den of adders. And I," he gestured around the cluttered, dusty workshop, filled with the ghosts of unfinished inventions and the gleaming precision of tools meticulously maintained, "am a forgotten relic." The workshop was a marvel of organized chaos. Diagrams yellowed with age were pinned to the walls alongside newer, starker calculations. Models of gears, levers, and strange winged contraptions littered every surface. It was a testament to a mind that had never stopped working, even if the world had stopped listening. Alara felt a familiar surge of kinship, of understanding. She carefully laid out her diagrams on a cleared space on his workbench, the crisp vellum a stark contrast to the surrounding clutter. Thorne bent over them, his initial skepticism warring with the ingrained habits of a master craftsman. He traced the lines of her proposed sluice gates with a calloused finger, his lips moving silently as he followed her calculations. He picked up her design for the tower watergate, a more compact and secure mechanism than Finch's rumoured ponderous affair. Minutes stretched into an hour. The only sounds were the rustle of vellum, Thorne's occasional grunt, and the distant clamour of London. Alara waited, her hands clasped tightly. This was the first, most critical hurdle. Finally, Thorne straightened up, his expression unreadable. "The mathematics are sound," he conceded, as if the words were being pried from him. "The principles are not entirely novel, echoes of the Low Countries perhaps, and some rather audacious applications of Archimedean screws I've not seen attempted on this scale." He tapped the Southwark design. "This counterweight system, it's bold, ingenious even, but deeply unconventional for this city's current crop of so-called engineers." He looked at her, a new light in his eyes. Not enthusiasm, not yet, but a grudging respect. "And you believe I can get this brilliance acknowledged?" "I believe, Master Thorn," Elara said, choosing her words carefully, "that if these designs were presented as originating from your own renewed study, perhaps inspired by some old notes of yours, that Lord Ashworth, who oversees the tower works and has an interest in efficient solutions for the river, might be persuaded to examine them. Finch's death creates a vacuum. Nature and politics abhor a vacuum." Thorn stroked his ragged beard. "Ashworth. I know of him. Ambitious, not entirely a fool, unlike some of his peers." He paced the small workshop. "To pretend these are mine, it's a deception, girl." "Is it more a deception, Master," Elara countered gently, "than a world that forces a mind like yours into obscurity and a mind like mine into silence simply because of the vessel it inhabits?" His gaze sharpened. She had struck a chord. The injustice of his own downfall was a wound that had never healed. To see a similar injustice, albeit differently manifested, in her— "You are playing a dangerous game, Mistress Vance," he said, his voice softer now. "If this comes to light. The greater danger, Master, is for London to remain vulnerable due to adherence to flawed tradition, or for brilliant solutions to languish unheard because their author wears a skirt." Thorn was silent again, but this time it was the silence of consideration, not dismissal. He picked up one of her diagrams, the one for the Tower Watergate. "This gearing, it's elegant, far superior to Finch's clumsy proposal." He let out a long breath. "Very well, Mistress Vance, very well. We shall attempt to awaken the slumbering giants of the Council, but on my terms. And if this goes awry," he fixed her with a steely look, "the consequences will be severe, for both of us." A fragile alliance was forged in the dusty gloom of the forgotten workshop, an alliance born of shared intellect, shared frustration, and a desperate, audacious hope. Elara felt a surge of triumph, quickly tempered by the enormity of the task ahead. This was only the beginning. The true challenge lay in navigating the treacherous currents of London's power structures, with Master Thorn as her unlikely and perhaps unreliable figurehead. The next few days were a whirlwind of clandestine activity. Elara spent her daylight hours maintaining the facade of a dutiful daughter, her needlework a cover for the furious calculations and refinements she made in her mind. Evenings, under the guise of charitable visits or delivering messages for her father, she would slip away to Master Thorn's workshop. Thorn, re-energized by a challenge that resonated with his own frustrated genius, was a demanding collaborator. He pored over Elara's designs, questioning every assumption, every calculation, pushing her to defend her reasoning. It was an intellectual crucible, unlike anything Elara had ever experienced. He wasn't gentle, his critiques often blunt, but they were always aimed at strengthening the work, at anticipating the objections the Guild or the Council would inevitably raise. "No, no, girl," he'd exclaim, stabbing a finger at a diagram. "This stress point here. You haven't accounted for the lateral torque if the tide comes in at an oblique angle. They'll tear that apart. Think, Vance. Think like the river, not just like a mathematician." And Elara would think, her mind stretching, adapting. She learned to translate her elegant equations into the practical language of timber strengths, metal fatigue, and the brutal realities of construction. Thorn, in turn, began to see beyond her gender, to recognize the formidable intellect at work. He began to redraft her designs in his own, more familiar hand, adding flourishes and annotations that would mark them as plausibly his own recovered work. It was a meticulous process of intellectual laundering. "We need a narrative," Thorn declared one evening amidst a clutter of revised scrolls. "Ashworth is no fool. He won't believe I simply conjured these from thin air after 20 years of contemplation." He winced. "We say I stumbled upon some old conceptual sketches of my late master, a brilliant but eccentric Fleming. Ideas ahead of their time. Finch's demise, it spurred me to revisit them, to see if, with modern refinements, they might offer a solution." It was a plausible enough fiction. Thorn's own early work had shown Flemish influences. "And the Southwark plans?" Elara asked. "A natural extension," Thorn mused. "Once the mind is re-engaged with such problems, one solution often illuminates another." He gave her a wry look. "You, Mistress Vance, are a particularly potent catalyst for illumination." The first test of their alliance came when Thorn, armed with the redrafted plans for the Tower Watergate, now presented as his refined Flemish concepts, sought an audience with Lord Ashworth. Alara waited in an agony of suspense at home, her embroidery needle jabbing a perfectly innocent piece of linen. Lord Edmund Ashworth was indeed a man of keen perception. He received Thorn in his private study, a room lined with books and maps, a far cry from the dusty guild halls. Ashworth was younger than Thorn, perhaps in his late 30s, with an alert, intelligent face and eyes that missed little. He listened patiently as Thorn, with a carefully rehearsed blend of humility and rediscovered confidence, laid out the plans. "Master Thorn," Ashworth said, when the presentation was complete, his fingers steepled. "It has been many years since your contributions to the city's engineering were so prominently discussed." His tone was neutral, inviting neither sycophancy nor defiance. "These designs are markedly different from Master Finch's. More compact, more ambitious, I would say." "Master Finch, may he rest in peace, was a man of cautious tradition, my lord," Thorn replied smoothly. "My late master, Vandermeer, was less constrained. He believed in harnessing natural forces, not merely resisting them." Ashworth studied the diagrams again. "The gearing mechanism for the gate lift, it is ingenious. And the proposed materials, bronze alloys for the key stress points, more expensive than Finch's iron, but doubtless more durable." He looked up, his gaze sharp. "You are confident this can be constructed efficiently, Master Thorn? The king desires no further delays at the tower." "With the correct craftsmen, my lord, and proper oversight," Thorn said, his voice gaining strength, "I believe it will prove both swifter to install and far more reliable than the previous design." Ashworth was silent for a moment, tapping a finger on the vellum. "The Engineers Guild will not be pleased. They have already put forward Master Giles, Finch's own protégé, as the natural successor." "Master Giles is a competent man, my lord, in Finch's mould," Thorn conceded. "But these times, perhaps, call for solutions beyond the conventional. The king's service demands the best, not merely the most familiar." A faint smile touched Ashworth's lips. He appreciated a well-turned phrase, and perhaps a subtle challenge to the guild's hegemony. "Very well, Master Thorn. I am intrigued. Prepare a more detailed estimate of costs and materials, and a list of craftsmen you would deem suitable. I will present this to the committee. But be warned," his smile faded, "if this is merely old wine in new bottles, or worse, unproven fantasy, the scrutiny will be intense." Thorn returned to his workshop that evening with a mixture of elation and trepidation. "He bit, girl, he bit," he told Alara, who had been waiting anxiously. "But the hook is not yet set. We must provide him with irrefutable details. Costs, logistics, artisans, he wants it all." This new phase of work was even more demanding. Alara, drawing on her father's mercantile knowledge of material costs and labour rates, helped Thorn prepare the detailed estimates. Identifying trustworthy, skilled craftsmen who wouldn't immediately run to the guild with tales of Thorn's unorthodox collaborator was another challenge. Thorn had a few old contacts, men who respected his past genius or owed him favours, but they were few. Meanwhile, word of Thorn's audience with Ashworth began to filter through the city. Master Giles, Finch's heir apparent at the guild, a stout, officious man named Edgar Collier, was said to be incandescent with rage. The guild prided itself on its autonomy in matters of engineering, and the idea of an outsider, a disgraced one at that, being consulted over their heads was an affront. Consigliere Hugh Pennington, a powerful and deeply conservative member of the Lord Mayor's Council, and a staunch ally of the established guilds, also took note. Pennington was a man who viewed all innovation with suspicion, seeing it as a precursor to disorder. He was particularly wary of Lord Ashworth's modernising tendencies. He made a point of discreetly inquiring about Master Thorn's sudden resurgence. The currents were shifting, and Alara knew their small boat was entering more turbulent waters. The Tower Watergate was a relatively small project, but it was a visible one, a symbol. If they succeeded here, it might open the door for her far more ambitious Southwark plans. If they failed, Thorn's ruin would be complete, and her own secret involvement, if discovered, could bring disgrace upon her family. The ink stains on her fingers felt heavier than ever. Lord Ashworth, true to his word, and perhaps relishing the opportunity to assert his influence, presented Master Thorn's revised plans for the Tower Watergate to the overseeing committee. As Thorn had predicted, the Engineers' Guild, represented by a spluttering Edgar Collier, protested vehemently. Collier decried Thorn's designs as reckless departures from proven methods and questioned Thorn's competence after his Cornhill catastrophe. Consigliere Pennington lent his considerable weight to Collier's objections. "My lords," Pennington intoned, his voice smooth but edged with disapproval, "while innovation has its place, the King's works at the Tower are hardly the arena for speculative experimentation. Master Finch's plans were sound, if perhaps unexciting. Master Giles is ready to implement them without delay." But Ashworth was prepared. He highlighted the projected efficiencies of Thorn's design, the superior durability of the proposed materials, and, crucially, a slightly reduced timeline for completion, a detail Elara had meticulously engineered into the logistics, knowing the King's impatience with delays. "Are we to serve the King with mere familiarity, Consigliere?" Ashworth countered, his voice cool, "or with the most effective solution available. Master Thorn's proposal, while unconventional, promises greater security and longevity for the Watergate. I, for one, believe it merits consideration." The debate was heated, but Ashworth's influence, combined with the undeniable elegance of the redrafted plans, which even Collier grudgingly admitted had a certain theoretical appeal, carried the day. Thorn's proposal was approved for the Tower Watergate on a probationary basis. He was to work under strict oversight, and any significant deviation or delay would result in the project being immediately handed back to the Guild. Elara, receiving the news from a triumphant but wary Thorn, felt a dizzying mixture of relief and anxiety. They had won the first skirmish, but the war for acceptance was far from over. The real test would be the execution. The construction of the new Watergate mechanism became Elara's obsession. She couldn't be physically present at the Tower, of course. That was Thorn's role. He, looking a decade younger with the fire of purpose rekindled in his eyes, meticulously oversaw the selected craftsmen, a small, trusted team, some of whom were old associates suspicious of the Guild's restrictive practices. Elara, however, was the unseen mind. Each evening, Thorn would report progress, relay problems, and bring back Finch's original, more detailed schematics for the surrounding structures, which Elara would study, looking for unforeseen complications or opportunities for subtle improvements to her own design's integration. One such problem arose quickly. A section of the old stonework, presumed sound by Finch, proved to be unstable when the preparatory work for Thorn's more compact mechanism began. Collier and the Guild, who had informants among the General Tower workforce, pounced on it as evidence of Thorn's ill-conceived plan destabilizing the existing structure. Pennington demanded an immediate halt. Elara worked through the night, calculations flying, her candle burning low. Finch's design had distributed weight differently. Her more concentrated mechanism required a different approach to load-bearing. By dawn, she had a solution, a series of cleverly angled internal buttresses, hidden within the wall, that would not only stabilize the weak stonework but also provide additional support for the new gate's lifting apparatus. It was an ingenious fix, almost invisible once completed. Thorn, armed with Elara's new diagrams, hastily redrafted by his own hand, presented the solution to Ashworth. "A minor unforeseen complication with the ancient masonry, my lord," Thorn explained, "easily rectified with a slight reinforcement as per these amended drawings. In fact, it will make the entire structure even more robust." Ashworth, already politically invested in Thorn's success, accepted the explanation, particularly as the solution appeared quick and effective. Work resumed, much to Collier's chagrin and Pennington's narrowed-eyed scrutiny. Elara, however, knew how close they had come to disaster. The incident reinforced her awareness of Grimaldi's English counterpart, Pennington, and the constant threat of sabotage, whether through malice or incompetence amplified by suspicion. The Watergate project moved forward, slowly but surely. There were other minor hitches, a delayed shipment of specialized bronze, a craftsman falling ill, each one a source of acute anxiety for Elara. She lived on a knife's edge, her days a performance of placid domesticity, her nights a fever of intellectual exertion and vicarious engineering. Her relationship with Thorn deepened into a true, if unconventional, partnership. He no longer called her girl with condescension, but with a grudging, almost paternal respect. He argued with her, challenged her, but he listened, and he trusted her intellect implicitly. Lorenzo Foscari, now Lord Burnet in this English setting, an ambitious member of Parliament with a keen interest in naval affairs and Thameside infrastructure, had been following the Tower Watergate saga with interest. He was not directly involved in that particular royal project, but he had his own pressing concerns. The wharves and warehouses in his constituency of Rotherhithe were increasingly plagued by inefficient dredging and the ever-present threat of localized flooding from the Thames' unpredictable surges. The official solutions proposed by the various city guilds were costly and, in Burnet's opinion, unimaginative. He had heard whispers of Master Thorne's resurgence, of the ingenious new Watergate at the Tower. He'd also heard the grumblings from the established engineers. Burnet, a pragmat thene, recognised the scent of untapped potential and perhaps a useful discreet asset. He arranged a meeting with Master Thorne, ostensibly to discuss some minor mechanical problems at one of his family's warehouses. Alara, when Thorne informed her of Burnet's approach, felt a familiar thrill of anticipation mixed with caution. Burnet was known to be a rising star, well-connected, but also notoriously opportunistic. If Ashworth was a cautious patron, Burnet might prove to be a far more demanding and perhaps more dangerous one. But his interest in river engineering was a direct path towards her true ambition, the Southwark defences or a similar large-scale project. "He speaks of warehouse mechanics, Thorne," Alara said, her brow furrowed as they discussed it in the workshop. "But his constituency is Rotherhithe. He is thinking of the river, I am certain of it." Thorne nodded. "He's a Foscari, a Burnet. They always play a longer game. Be wary, Alara." He used her given name now, a mark of their changed dynamic. Men like Burnet see people as pieces on a chessboard, useful until they are not. "But a useful piece can still influence the game, Master Thorne," Alara countered, her eyes bright. "And if his game aligns with improving London's defences against the Thames, then perhaps we can both win." The stage was being set for a new, more complex alliance, with higher stakes and potentially greater rewards. The Tower Watergate was nearing completion, a testament to their clandestine collaboration. But Alara knew it was merely a prelude. The river, in all its power and unpredictability, was calling. And Lord Burnet, it seemed, might just be the one to provide the vessel for her voyage into its challenging currents. The Tower Watergate was completed on schedule, a sleek, efficient mechanism of bronze and seasoned oak that operated with a smoothness that silenced many of Master Thorne's critics. Lord Ashworth was visibly pleased, and King Henry VII, on a brief inspection, was said to have grunted his approval, high praise from the parsimonious monarch. Thorne received a modest bonus and, more importantly, a degree of restored public credit. Edgar Collier and the Engineers Guild were forced into a sullen acceptance, while Consigliere Pennington watched, his suspicions undiminished, but for the moment without ammunition. Alara felt a profound private satisfaction. To see her calculations translate into tangible, functioning reality, even anonymously, was a powerful affirmation. The success, however, was a double-edged sword. It drew further attention to Master Thorne, and by extension to the source of his revitalized ingenuity. Lord Burnet, true to Alara's prediction, did not confine his discussions with Thorne to mere warehouse mechanics. During their second meeting held discreetly at Thorne's workshop, Burnet laid his cards on the table. "Master Thorne," Burnet began, his charming smile belying the shrewdness in his eyes, "your work at the Tower has not gone unnoticed. There are those of us who believe the city's relationship with the Thames requires a more forward-thinking approach than is currently favoured by certain, shall we say, entrenched interests." He gestured vaguely, a dismissal of the established guilds. "The river is a powerful mistress, my lord," Thorne said cautiously. "She requires respect and understanding." "Precisely," Burnet agreed. "And my constituents in Rotherhithe, and indeed much of Southwark, suffer from her moods more than most. The current flood defences are a patchwork, expensive to maintain and unreliable. The dredging of the channels is haphazard. We need a comprehensive strategy, Master Thorne. Something bold. Something like the mind behind that Tower Gate." His gaze was direct, and Thorne felt a prickle of unease. Burnet was too perceptive. "My lord," Thorne said, maintaining his composure, "the Tower Gate was a refinement of old principles, As for the river's broader challenges, they are of a different magnitude entirely. Indeed, Burnett said, his smile widening, which is why they require a mind of commensurate magnitude. You have a reclusive student, I believe, Master Thorn? One with a particular gift for hydrodynamics and structural analysis? Thorn's heart hammered. How much did Burnett know or suspect? Elara, concealed in a small alcove behind a heavy curtain where she often worked on her calculations during Thorn's meetings, held her breath. This was the moment of reckoning. Thorn hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. I have an assistant, my lord, a young person of keen intellect who aids me in my calculations and draughtsmanship. Their contributions are valuable. He kept it deliberately vague. Burnett chuckled. An assistant of such talent they can transform a forgotten artisan into the talk of the tower? Master Thorn, I am not Consigliere Pennington. I do not fear innovation, wherever it may originate. I seek results. And I suspect the true architect of these recent successes is not entirely conventional. He paused, letting his words hang in the air. My proposition is simple. I have considerable influence on the Thames Navigation Committee. I can secure funding for a pilot project, perhaps a new system of reinforced embankments and adaptive sluice gates for a particularly vulnerable stretch of Rotherhithe. A project that, if successful, could be expanded. I need the best design, the most innovative solution, and I am willing to provide the political cover and the resources for such a design to be realized. He looked directly at the curtain behind which Elara was hidden. Naturally, the public credit would accrue to appropriate parties. Master Thorn as the supervising engineer, myself as the visionary patron, but the true author of the success would have my gratitude and, more tangibly, the opportunity to see their work implemented on a grand scale. And, of course, a discreet share of any financial rewards that such public works often generate for those involved in their efficient execution. It was a bold proposition. Her genius, his political capital, their mutual benefit, all conducted under a veil of necessary secrecy. Elara felt a surge of conflicting emotions. The opportunity was immense, a direct path to realizing her most ambitious designs. But Burnett's astuteness was unnerving. He was offering her a gilded cage, a way to exercise her talents, but only on his terms. Her identity still a carefully guarded secret, her public recognition channeled through him. Thorn looked towards the curtain, a silent question in his eyes. Elara knew the decision was ultimately hers. To remain in the relative safety of her current anonymity, making small, incremental impacts. Or to step into this larger, more dangerous arena, allied with a man whose ambition might be as great a threat as it was an opportunity. The memory of those flawed Southwark plans, of a vulnerable London, tipped the scales. This was what she had worked for, dreamed of. After a moment, Elara stepped out from behind the curtain. Lord Burnett's eyebrows rose slightly, but his smile did not falter. He had clearly suspected, or perhaps even known. "My lord," Elara said, her voice calm despite the tremor in her hands, "your proposition is intriguing. The challenges of the Thames are indeed great, and I believe I may have some preliminary thoughts on the matter." Burnett's smile became genuine. "Mistress Vance, I presume? I had a feeling Master Thorn's reclusive student was of a somewhat more unexpected caliber." He gave a slight bow. "I am delighted to make your acquaintance, albeit under these discreet circumstances. Your reputation, though whispered, precedes you." He turned back to Thorn. "Well, Master Thorn, it seems we have the makings of a most fruitful, if unconventional, collaboration." Thorn, seeing Elara's resolve, nodded slowly. "It would seem so, my lord, but understand this. Mistress Vance's contribution and her safety are paramount. Any breach of this discretion would be detrimental to us all. Master Thorn," Burnett finished smoothly, "I assure you I value discretion as highly as I value results." He looked at Elara. "Mistress Vance, I look forward to seeing these preliminary thoughts. The Thames awaits your intervention." The alliance was struck. More complex, more dangerous, but also more potent than before. Elara now had a patron with the political will and resources to champion her most ambitious designs. But she was also more exposed, her secret known to a man whose motives were, at best, pragmatically aligned with her own. The game had changed. The stakes were higher, and the currents of the Thames and of London's intricate power games were about to become far more turbulent. The Rotherhithe pilot project, as Lord Burnett discreetly termed it, became the focus of Alara's existence. It was a chance to implement the core principles of her Southwark defence designs on a smaller, yet still significant scale. She proposed a system of interlocking reinforced timber embankments, combined with a series of new, counterweighted sluice gates, a more sophisticated version of the tower mechanism, designed to manage tidal flow and prevent storm surge incursions in a notoriously flood-prone section of Burnett's constituency. The collaboration was intense. Alara and Thorne worked for weeks in his workshop, refining the designs, calculating stresses, and devising construction sequences. Burnett, meanwhile, navigated the treacherous waters of city politics. He presented the project to the Thames Navigation Committee as a bold but necessary experiment, leveraging Thorne's recent success at the Tower and his own growing influence. He emphasised the potential cost savings in the long term, a language the city aldermen understood. Consigliere Pennington and Edgar Collar of the Engineers Guild were predictably apoplectic. Pennington saw it as another example of Burnett's reckless ambition and a further erosion of traditional authority. Collier viewed it as a direct affront to the Guild's purview over all river works. This, protégé of Lord Burnett's, Collier fumed in a Guild meeting, referring to Thorne, would turn the Thames into his personal laboratory. These are untried, fantastical notions. The river demands proven methods, not the scribblings of a disgraced clockmaker and his shadowy assistant. The implication, though unspoken, was clear. Thorne was not working alone, and his helper was likely an unqualified upstart. Pennington, more subtly, raised concerns in council about the project's potential to disrupt established trade routes along the Rotherhithe wharves during construction. He commissioned Guild-approved surveyors to produce reports highlighting the inherent risks of Thorne's unconventional structures. Alara, receiving these updates from Thorne or occasionally encoded messages from Burnett's office, felt the pressure mount. Each objection, each hurdle, had to be countered with meticulous data, revised calculations or alternative logistical plans. She learned to anticipate Pennington's lines of attack, to think several moves ahead. It was a relentless game of intellectual chess, played for the highest stakes. One evening, Burnett summoned Thorne, and by extension Alara, to a clandestine meeting at a disused warehouse he owned on the Isle of Dogs, far from the prying eyes of the city. The air in the vast, dusty space was thick with the scent of old rope and river mud. "Pennington is proving more tenacious than anticipated," Burnett said, his usual urbane manner slightly frayed. "He has instigated a formal review of the proposed embankment materials, claiming your specifications for seasoned oak and iron bracings are unnecessarily extravagant and potentially unsound in prolonged submersion." He paced the length of a shadowy beam. "He has allies on the review panel. They intend to delay us, perhaps indefinitely, by bogging us down in endless technical debates." Alara felt a cold knot of frustration. This was classic obstructionism. "My lord," she said, stepping forward, her voice tight, "the specifications are precise for a reason. The forces exerted by a full spring tide combined with easterly gales are immense. Anything less than the highest quality materials, properly treated and reinforced, will fail. It is not extravagance, it is engineering necessity." "I do not doubt your calculations, Mistress Vance," Burnett said, stopping to face her. "But proving that to a panel stacked with Pennington's cronies is another matter. We need something to shift the narrative, something undeniable." Thorne spoke up. "Perhaps a demonstration, my lord? A scale model subjected to simulated forces. It would be complex to construct, but—" Alara's mind was already racing ahead. "More than a model, Master Thorne. What if we could find an existing structure, perhaps a smaller, failing embankment elsewhere, and apply a section of our proposed reinforcement method to it? A real-world test, quickly executed. If it holds where the old methods are clearly failing—" Burnett's eyes lit up. "A comparative demonstration. Brilliant, Mistress Vance. Yes! There's a stretch of old wharf wall near Wapping, notoriously unstable, constantly needing repair by the Guild's outdated methods. If we could discreetly shore up a section using your techniques and it outlasts the adjacent Guild-repaired sections through the next neap tide cycle. It would be a powerful visual argument," Alara finished. "And it could be done relatively quickly, with a small, trusted team." The plan was audacious, bordering on insubordination, as it involved working outside official channels on a structure technically under Guild jurisdiction. But Burnett, seeing the potential to outmaneuver Pennington, was intrigued. Discretion would be paramount, he mused. But the impact? Yes. Master Thorne, can you assemble such a team? Mistress Vance, can you provide the precise specifications for a rapid, localized reinforcement? The Wapping Gambit, as Ilara privately called it, was fraught with risk. If discovered, they could be accused of vandalism or unauthorized interference, jeopardizing the entire Rotherhithe project. But the potential reward, irrefutable proof of their method's superiority, was too tempting to ignore. Over the next week, under the cover of darkness and facilitated by Burnett's discreet provision of materials and a barge, Thorne and a handful of loyal, tight-lipped craftsmen worked on the crumbling Wapping Wharf. Ilara, though not physically present, had provided meticulously detailed plans for a short section of reinforced revetment, using innovative timber joinery and iron ties she had designed. It was a miniature version of her larger vision. As they worked, one of Thorne's men reported seeing figures watching from the shadows on the opposite bank, likely Pennington's informants or simply curious night watchmen. The tension was palpable. Finally, it was done. A 20-foot section of the Wapping Wharf now stood newly and almost invisibly reinforced, nestled between two visibly decaying segments patched with the Guild's traditional and failing methods. Now, they could only wait for the Thames and Pennington's review panel to deliver their verdicts. Ilara felt as though she had cast a message in a bottle into a vast, unpredictable ocean. The fate of the Rotherhithe project, and perhaps her own future ability to contribute, hung in the balance, dependent on the strength of oak iron and her own hidden ingenuity. The weight was excruciating. Ilara found it difficult to concentrate on her household duties, her mind constantly replaying the calculations for the Wapping reinforcement, imagining the immense pressure of the river against it. Lord Burnett, with an air of studied nonchalance, allowed Pennington's review panel to proceed with their ponderous deliberations on the Rotherhithe material specifications. He knew, as did Ilara and Thorne, that the real test was happening silently, relentlessly, at the Wapping Wharf. The neap tides came and went, followed by a series of higher-than-usual spring tides, exacerbated by a persistent easterly wind that funneled water up the Thames estuary. Reports began to filter through the city of minor flooding in several low-lying areas and of further damage to riverside structures. Edgar Collier and the Engineers Guild were kept busy with emergency repairs. Then, one morning, Lord Burnett requested an on-site inspection for the review panel, ostensibly to examine the very wharf sections at Wapping that were causing the Guild such trouble. He invited Consigliere Pennington and several key aldermen. Master Thorne was also asked to attend, as an observer with alternative expertise. Ilara, though not present, could picture the scene vividly from Thorne's later, gleeful recounting. The panel arrived at the Wapping Wharf to find a scene of contrasted realities. The sections repaired by traditional Guild methods were visibly battered, with fresh cracks in the masonry and slumped timbers. Water still seeped through in several places. But the 20-foot section that Thorne's team had secretly reinforced stood firm, almost untouched, dry and solid amidst the surrounding decay. The contrast was stark, undeniable. Even Pennington's carefully chosen experts could not ignore the visual evidence. One of them, a Guild-affiliated mason known for his pragmatism, was seen running his hand along the new timberwork, a look of grudging admiration on his face. "Remarkable, Master Thorne," Lord Burnett observed loudly, for all to hear. "This particular section seems to have weathered the recent tides with singular resilience. A different method of construction, perhaps?" Thorne, playing his part, gave a modest shrug. "Some older techniques, my lord, focusing on deeper pilings and interlocking joinery, adapted for the specific stresses of this location." Consigliere Pennington's face was a mask of controlled fury. He knew he had been outmaneuvered, though he couldn't prove how. "A fortunate anomaly, perhaps," he muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. The tide, both literal and metaphorical, had turned. The review panel, faced with the undeniable success of the Wapping reinforcement, which Burnett artfully presented as a small independent test of principles similar to those Master Thorne proposes for Rotherhithe, could hardly maintain their objections to the Rotherhithe project's material specifications. Pennington was forced into a strategic retreat. The Rotherhithe pilot project was formally approved, with Thorne, and by extension Elara, given considerable leeway in its execution. The victory was sweet, but Elara knew it was only one battle. Pennington's opposition would not simply vanish, it would become more subtle, more insidious, and the challenges of the Rotherhithe project itself were immense. It was one thing to reinforce a 20-foot section of wharf. It was another entirely to construct new embankments and sluice gates along a significant stretch of turbulent river. Construction began in earnest. Elara, working through Thorne, became the project's unseen chief architect. She devised innovative solutions for driving piles into the difficult clay riverbed, designed prefabricated caissons that could be floated into place, and meticulously planned the logistics of material delivery to minimize disruption to river traffic, directly addressing one of Pennington's earlier criticisms. Thorne, with his growing team of loyal craftsmen, translated her designs into reality, marveling at her ability to anticipate and solve problems he hadn't even foreseen. Lord Burnett, true to his word, provided the political shield. He smoothed over disputes with disgruntled wharfingers, expedited permits, and ensured a steady flow of funds. He also began to rely more directly on Elara's intellect. Occasionally he would send urgent, coded queries directly to her, bypassing Thorne on matters of engineering or even broader civic planning where he sought an unconventional perspective. Their relationship remained one of careful utility, but a thread of mutual intellectual respect was beginning to weave through it. Elara, while still wary of his ambition, found herself increasingly stimulated by the scope of the problems he presented. However, their success did not go unnoticed by Edgar Collier. The Guildmaster, humiliated by the Wapping demonstration and the subsequent approval of the Rotherhithe project, became obsessed with discrediting Thorne and uncovering the source of his miraculous new abilities. He knew Thorne of old. The man was brilliant but erratic, and prone to overly complex designs that often failed in practice. This new Thorne was different, precise, practical, almost prescient. Collier suspected a hidden hand, and he was determined to expose it. He began to assign his own apprentices to observe the Rotherhithe works, ostensibly for educational purposes, but in reality to act as spies, looking for any deviation, any mistake, any clue to Thorne's mysterious collaborator. Elara, warned by Thorne, became even more cautious. Her visits to the workshop were less frequent, their communications more reliant on coded messages passed through trusted intermediaries. The attic room, once her sanctuary, now felt more like a command center, the weight of an entire district's safety resting on her hidden calculations. The ink stains on her fingers were no longer just a symbol of her passion, but of a profound and perilous responsibility. She was shaping a part of her city, moulding its defenses against the relentless river, but she had to do so from the deepest shadows, her name unknown, her contribution invisible to the world she was striving to protect. The irony was not lost on her, a constant, bittersweet companion to her burgeoning sense of achievement. The Rotherhithe project progressed through the seasons. Spring brought high tides and driving rains, testing the partially completed embankments. Summer saw long days of labour, the rhythmic clang of hammers and the shouts of foremen echoing across the river. Elara, through Thorne's daily reports and her own occasional, carefully disguised nocturnal observations from the opposite bank, lived every challenge, every minor setback, every small triumph. One of Collier's observing apprentices, a young man named Silas, proved to be particularly persistent. He was clever, with a keen eye for detail, and he seemed less interested in learning than in finding fault. Silas was often seen sketching the construction methods, asking pointed questions of Thorne's craftsmen, and loitering near the site office where Thorne kept Elara's redrafted plans. Elara, anticipating this, had designed several layers of misdirection into the publicly available schematics. The core innovative principles were there, but certain crucial details regarding the precise gearing ratios of the sluice gates or the composition of the specialized mortar for the deep foundations were either omitted or deliberately obfuscated. recorded only in her private notes and conveyed, verbally, to Thorne. The core innovative principles were there, but certain crucial details regarding the precise gearing ratios of the sluice gates or the composition of the specialized mortar for the deep foundations were either omitted or deliberately obfuscated, recorded only in her private notes and conveyed hugs. One sweltering July afternoon, a crisis erupted. A critical section of cofferdam, holding back the river while a deep foundation for a major sluice gate was being laid, began to show signs of imminent collapse. Water was seeping through at an alarming rate, threatening to flood the entire worksite and set the project back by months. Thorne sent an urgent, panicked message to Elara. His own on-site attempts to reinforce the dam were failing. Panic was a luxury Elara could not afford. Her mind, honed by countless such intellectual emergencies, raced. The publicly available plans for the cofferdam were standard, robust enough for most conditions, but not for the unusual subsurface Thorne had described in his message, a pocket of unexpectedly soft silt. Her more advanced private design for such contingencies involved a rapid system of cross-bracing and pressure relief culverts, but implementing it now, with the dam already failing, was immensely risky. There was no time for coded messages or intermediaries. Donning her plainest gown and a heavy veil, ostensibly on an urgent errand of mercy for her mother, Elara made her way towards Rotherhithe. She couldn't go directly to the site. Collier's apprentice, Silas, or other informants would surely be watching. Instead, she went to a small, disused boat builder's shed near the edge of the works, a place Thorne had identified as a possible emergency rendezvous. She found Thorne there, his face grey with exhaustion and despair. "It's going. Elara," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "We've tried everything. The silt is like quicksand." "Show me the latest sounding reports," Elara commanded, her voice low but firm, already shedding her cloak, her mind focused entirely on the engineering problem. She spread the rough sketches Thorne had made of the failing section on a dusty workbench. Within minutes, she had identified the precise failure point and the only viable, albeit dangerous, solution. "We have to relieve the pressure from behind the weak point, Master Thorne, not just fight it from the front," she explained, rapidly sketching a new diagram. A series of small, targeted breaches on the landward side, channeled away, combined with immediate, concentrated reinforcement here and here. She indicated precise points on his sketch. "It will cause some localized flooding behind the dam, but it will save the main foundation." It was counterintuitive, a controlled partial failure to prevent a catastrophic total one. Thorne stared at her sketch, his eyes widening as he grasped the audacious logic. "By the saints, girl, it might just work. But the risk, if we breach it in the wrong places, the risk of doing nothing is a certainty of total collapse," Elara stated flatly. "You must direct the men. I have marked the sequence and the critical angles." Just as Thorne was about to leave, the door of the shed creaked open. Silas, Collier's apprentice, stood there, his eyes wide with a mixture of suspicion and surprise at finding not just Thorne, but a veiled woman, clearly in command, surrounded by technical drawings. "Master Thorne," Silas began, his voice uncertain but with an underlying edge of accusation. "I saw you enter. What is amiss with the cofferdam? Master Collier should be informed of any irregularities." His gaze flickered to Elara, then back to the diagrams. Thorne stepped forward, blocking Silas's view of Elara. "A minor consultation, apprentice. A matter of historical precedent I wish to discuss regarding ancient river works." His attempt at nonchalance was unconvincing. Silas was not deterred. "That looked like a new design, Master. And this lady?" Elara knew this was a critical moment. Exposure now would be disastrous. Before Thorne could blunder further, she spoke, her voice deliberately altered, adopting the hesitant, slightly high-pitched tone of a non-threatening woman. "Oh, dear me, Master Thorne was just explaining the dreadful river to me. My cousin works on the site, a simple labourer, and I grow so fearful for his safety with all this talk of floods." She gave a little fluttering sigh, a caricature of feminine anxiety. "These drawings, they mean nothing to me, of course. So very complicated." Silas looked from her to Thorne, a flicker of doubt in his eyes. Elara's performance, combined with her heavy veil and plain attire, seemed to align more with his preconceived notions of a concerned female relative than a master engineer. Thorn, catching on, added gruffly. Indeed. Now, if you'll excuse us, apprentice, we have urgent matters. The dam requires my immediate attention. He practically bundled Silas out of the shed, but Elara saw the lingering suspicion in the apprentice's eyes as he glanced back at the workbench. He wasn't entirely convinced. He suspects Elara, Thorn said grimly once Silas was gone. He will report this. Then we have no time to lose, Elara said, her earlier composure returning. The dam, Master Thorn. Focus on the dam. We will deal with Silas and Collier later. If the foundation is lost, none of it will matter. Thorn nodded, his own anxieties momentarily eclipsed by the engineering imperative. He took a hastily drawn diagram and rushed back to the worksite, bellowing orders. Elara remained in the shed, a silent, unseen commander, her heart pounding. She had averted immediate exposure, but the net was tightening. And the river, indifferent to their human dramas, continued its relentless assault on the fragile coffer dam. The success of her design and the secrecy of her involvement were both hanging by the slenderest of threads. The controlled breaches, executed with desperate precision by Thorn's team following Elara's instructions, worked. Water gushed into the prepared spillway channels on the landward side, relieving the critical pressure. The main section of the cofferdam, though groaning, held. The foundation pit was saved from inundation. By nightfall, the immediate crisis was over, though the worksite was a muddy chaos. Thorn, exhausted but triumphant, found Elara still in the boat builder's shed, meticulously cleaning her charcoal-stained fingers. "You did it, Elara," he said, his voice filled with awe. "By all the saints, you saved it. I've never seen anything like it." "We saved it, Master Thorn," she corrected gently. "Your men's courage and skill in executing a dangerous plan were as crucial as the design." But a quiet pride warmed her. Her theories, her calculations, had held firm against the raw power of the Thams. Their relief, however, was short-lived. The next morning, as predicted, Silas the apprentice made a detailed report to Master Edgar Collier. He spoke of Thorn's panic, the mysterious, veiled woman in the shed, the hastily drawn diagrams, and the unorthodox method used to save the dam, a method not found in any guild-approved manual. Collier seized upon it. Here was the proof he needed of Thorn's incompetence and reliance on an unnamed, unqualified, and possibly dangerous collaborator. He immediately lodged a formal complaint with the Thames Navigation Committee, demanding a full inquiry into the Rotherhithe project's safety protocols and Thorn's irregular conduct. He strongly implied that Thorn's assistant was a charlatan whose reckless methods had endangered the entire project. Lord Burnett, furious at this challenge to his authority and the potential derailment of his pet project, summoned Thorn. Elara, knowing she would be the unnamed subject of the inquiry, insisted on accompanying him, though she remained heavily veiled and silent during the tense meeting in Burnett's grand Cheapside townhouse. "Collier is baying for blood," Burnett said, pacing his study. "He claims your methods are unorthodox to the point of recklessness, Thorn, and he is deeply suspicious of your consultant." His gaze flickered towards Elara. "He demands to know the identity and qualifications of this individual who appears to be directing critical engineering decisions." "My lord," Thorn began, his voice steady, "the cofferdam was saved, not endangered, by swift and decisive action. The methods, while perhaps unfamiliar to Master Collier, were based on sound hydraulic principles." "Sound principles that almost led to your consultant being discovered in a boat shed, Thorn," Burnett snapped, his frustration evident. "This secrecy is becoming a liability. Collier will not rest until he has a name, a face, and if that face is Mistress Vance's." He left the implication hanging. Accusations of witchcraft, or at the very least of a woman grossly overstepping her station and meddling in grave public works, could be ruinous for all of them. Elara felt a chill. She had known the risks, but hearing them articulated by Burnett, a man who valued pragmatism above all, brought them into sharp focus. "Collier has demanded that Master Thorn and his chief assistant appear before an emergency session of the Navigation Committee to explain the incident and demonstrate the soundness of their ongoing designs," Burnett continued. "He clearly expects Thorn to dissemble or to produce some unqualified lackey, at which point he will move to have the project suspended and control handed to the Guild." This was Collier's trap. If Thorn appeared alone, he would be accused of hiding his collaborator. If he appeared with Alara, her identity would be revealed with potentially catastrophic consequences. There must be a way, Alara said, her voice quiet but firm, speaking for the first time. Burnett looked at her, surprised by her directness. Master Collier expects a confrontation. He expects us to defend the specific methods used at the cofferdam. Perhaps we should not give him the battle he expects. What do you mean, Mistress Vance? Burnett asked, intrigued despite himself. Instead of defending the emergency measure, Alara explained, her mind already working through the strategic possibilities, we shift the focus. We present the overall design for the Rotherhithe defences, the embankments, the sluice gate system, as a complete integrated concept. We demonstrate its inherent stability, its superiority to traditional methods, using models and calculations. We make the cofferdam incident seem like a minor, successfully managed hiccup within a far grander, well-conceived plan. Thorne caught her meaning. We overwhelm them with the brilliance of the whole, so the part seems insignificant. Precisely, Alara affirmed. And for the chief assistant, Master Collier expects a person. But what if the assistant is not a person, but a method, a system of calculation, a newly rediscovered treatise? Burnett stared at her, a slow smile spreading across his face. A method? Mistress Vance, truly audacious. He began to pace again, but this time with a new energy. Yes, Thorne, you claim to have rediscovered and adapted the work of your old Flemish master, Vandermeer. What if these Vandermeer principles are presented as the assistant? A comprehensive system of hydraulic engineering so advanced that it requires your expertise to interpret and apply. Collier cannot cross-examine a set of principles. He cannot demand a treatise to take a competency test. It was a daring piece of misdirection, a gamble on intellectual obfuscation. They would build a fortress of theory around Thorne, making him the sole interpreter of a near-mythical body of knowledge. We will need models, Thorne, Burnett said, his voice decisive. Working models of the sluice gates, detailed diagrams of the entire embankment system. We will turn this inquiry into a masterclass on advanced engineering, with you as the sole professor. Collier and his guild lackeys will be left looking like bewildered, out-of-their-depth apprentices. The plan was risky. It relied on Thorne's ability to perform convincingly as the sole repository of this complex knowledge, and on the committee members being more impressed by sophisticated theory than by Collier's accusations. Alara would have to prepare Thorne meticulously, arming him with answers to every conceivable technical question. It will require intensive preparation, my lord, Thorne said, looking at Alara. Then you have little time to waste, Burnett replied. The hearing is in 3 days. Make your Vandermeer principles unassailable, Master Thorne. The future of the Rotherhithe project, and perhaps all of our reputations, depends on it. Alara felt a surge of adrenaline. Collier's trap might just become their greatest platform. She had 3 days to distill years of her work into a defensible, dazzling system that Thorne could present as his own rediscovered heritage. The stakes had never been higher. The 3 days leading up to the Navigation Committee hearing were a blur of relentless activity. Alara barely slept, fueled by watered wine and a fierce determination. She and Thorne transformed his workshop into a crucible of intellectual forgery. She drafted new, comprehensive diagrams, imbued with a deliberate, slightly archaic Flemish style detailing the Vandermeer principles of dynamic fluvial engineering. She wrote pages of theoretical explanations, filled with complex equations and classical allusions, all designed to sound like the rediscovered wisdom of a forgotten Renaissance master. Thorne, for his part, memorized, questioned, and absorbed. Alara drilled him relentlessly, posing as a skeptical committee member, attacking every potential weakness in the principles. He had to not only understand the concepts, but also embody the persona of the sole inheritor of this profound knowledge. It was an acting role as much as an engineering defense. Remember, Master Thorne, Alara coached him, your confidence must be absolute. Any hesitation, any sign that you are merely reciting, and Collier will pounce. These are your rediscovered truths. You have lived with them, wrestled with them. They also constructed a small, intricate working model of the proposed Rotherhithe sluice gate system, complete with miniature counterweights and channels for water flow. It was a masterpiece of craftsmanship, designed to be both demonstrative and dazzling. On the day of the hearing, the Guildhall chamber was packed. Edgar Collier sat at the forefront, his expression one of barely concealed triumph, flanked by his guild supporters and consigliere Pennington. Lord Burnett sat with the committee members, his face a mask of calm neutrality, though Elara, watching from a heavily veiled position in the small public gallery, a privilege secured by Burnett with some difficulty, could sense his underlying tension. Thorn, dressed in his best, if somewhat threadbare robes, stood before them, a stack of scrolls and the sluice gate model on a table beside him. He looked older, perhaps, but there was a new authority in his bearing, a gravitas Elara had carefully cultivated. Collier opened the attack, his voice dripping with sarcasm. He recounted the cofferdam incident, painting Thorn as incompetent and reliant on shadowy, unqualified advice. He demanded that Thorn reveal the identity of his so-called assistant and submit their qualifications for guild scrutiny. Thorn listened patiently. When Collier had finished, he did not address the cofferdam directly. Instead, he unrolled his largest scroll, revealing a complex diagram of the entire Rotherhithe defence system. "Gentlemen of the committee," Thorn began, his voice surprisingly strong and resonant. "Master Collier speaks of a single, challenging moment in a project of immense complexity. To understand that moment, one must first understand the revolutionary principles upon which this entire endeavour is founded. Principles I have painstakingly recovered from the lost works of my late master, the brilliant Leven van der Meer of Bruges." For the next hour, Thorn delivered a tour de force. He explained the Van der Meer principles, using the model to demonstrate the dynamic counterweight system of the sluice gates, the calculations for stress distribution in the embankments, the theories of sediment flow and erosion control. He spoke of hydrodynamic resonance, fluvial harmonics, and isostatic balancing, terms Elara had either unearthed from obscure ancient texts or artfully invented, all sounding impeccably learned. He answered technical questions with a fluency and depth that astonished the committee and visibly disconcerted Collier. When Collier tried to interrupt, to bring the focus back to the unqualified assistant, Thorn calmly stated, "My assistant, Master Collier, is this." He tapped the scrolls. "The profound wisdom of Van der Meer. It is a demanding collaborator, I assure you, requiring constant study and interpretation, but its guidance is unerring." Consigliere Pennington attempted to pick holes in the theory, but Thorn, armed with Elara's exhaustive preparations, parried every thrust, citing obscure and often fictional Flemish treatises and complex mathematical proofs. Lord Burnett, with a subtle smile, occasionally interjected with a seemingly innocent question that allowed Thorn to further showcase his, Elara's, erudition. By the end of Thorn's presentation, the mood in the chamber had shifted. The committee members, initially sceptical, were now leaning forward, intrigued, some even impressed. Collier was sputtering, his accusations sounding increasingly petty and ill-informed in the face of Thorn's overwhelming display of borrowed expertise. He had expected to expose a charlatan. Instead, he found himself outmanoeuvred by a seemingly resurrected master. "So, Master Thorn," Lord Ashworth, who was chairing the committee, finally said, a note of dry amusement in his voice, "you attribute these remarkable innovations entirely to the legacy of Van der Meer, interpreted by yourself?" "Entirely, my lord," Thorn affirmed with a modest bow. "I am but a conduit for a wisdom greater than my own." The committee deliberated briefly. Their verdict was a significant victory for Thorn and Burnett. While they issued a mild caution regarding on-site safety protocols, a token gesture to Collier, they expressed their profound interest in the Van der Meer principles and gave their full backing for the continuation of the Rotherhithe project under Thorn's supervision. Collier's demand for the assistant's identity was dismissed as irrelevant. Thorn had not just survived, he had triumphed. Elara, hidden in the gallery, allowed herself a small, shaky breath of relief. Their audacious gamble had paid off. The Van der Meer principles were now an accepted, if mysterious, part of London's engineering landscape. As the chamber emptied, Lord Burnett caught Elara's eye from across the room. He gave a minuscule, almost imperceptible nod, a silent acknowledgement of her unseen victory. But Elara also saw the calculation in his gaze. She had proven herself an invaluable asset, a secret weapon of immense power, and she knew, with a certainty that tempered her triumph, that Lord Burnett would not be inclined to let such a weapon remain idle for long. The play was over, but the game was far from won. Her anonymity was preserved for now. But her destiny was now inextricably linked with the ambitions of powerful men and the relentless demands of the city she was secretly reshaping. The success at the Navigation Committee hearing had a profound effect. Master Thorne, now the custodian of the mysterious and highly effective Vandermeer principles, found his status transformed. He was no longer the disgraced clockmaker, but a respected, if somewhat eccentric, authority on fluvial engineering. Lord Burnett, his patronage vindicated, saw his own star rise further in city politics, and the Rotherhithe pilot project, once a contentious experiment, became a flagship enterprise, eagerly watched by many. For Alara, life continued in its strange duality. By day, she was Mistress Vance, managing her father's household accounts, deflecting her mother's persistent inquiries about suitable husbands, and enduring the stultifying embroidery circles. By night, or in stolen moments, she was the unseen architect of London's future, her mind grappling with the immense technical challenges of taming the Thames, her calculations filling secret ledgers. The Rotherhithe embankments and sluice gates took shape with remarkable speed and efficiency, a testament to the soundness of her designs and Thorne's increasingly confident site management. The quality of the construction, the innovative techniques, and the project's adherence to schedule silenced most of the remaining critics. Even Edgar Collier, though still privately seething, was forced to temper his public attacks, lest he appear an enemy of progress. Consigliere Pennington, however, remained a silent, watchful adversary, his disapproval a palpable force in the city's undercurrents. Lord Burnett, emboldened by the project's success, began to consult Alara, always through Thorne or via discreet unsigned notes, on a wider range of issues. He sought her input on proposals for improving sanitation in the crowded city wards, on the feasibility of new trade routes requiring canal modifications, even on the optimal design for a new type of crane for the burgeoning docklands. Alara, hungry for intellectual challenges, threw herself into these problems, providing insightful analyses and innovative solutions that Burnett would then artfully present as his own, or attribute to, further applications of the Vandermeer methodology. Her world, once confined to her attic room and Thorne's dusty workshop, was expanding, albeit vicariously. She was influencing the development of her city in ways she had never dreamed possible. Yet the invisibility was a constant chafe. To see her ideas praised, her solutions implemented, while the credit flowed to others, was a bittersweet experience. There were moments of intense frustration, a yearning for recognition, for her name to be attached to her work, but she knew the price of such openness. Master Thorne, increasingly reliant on her intellect, became fiercely protective. He was the public face, the interpreter, but he never forgot the source of the principles. Theirs was a symbiotic relationship, built on mutual respect and a shared secret. "They marvel at Vandermeer, Alara," he'd say, a twinkle in his eye, after a particularly successful presentation to a group of aldermen. If only they knew the true master was a woman half his imagined age, scribbling by candlelight in Cheapside. One of the most significant new challenges Burnett brought to them concerned the persistent problem of the Fleet River. This ancient tributary, which flowed into the Thames, had become a notorious open sewer, choked with refuse, prone to noxious flooding, and a breeding ground for disease in the heart of the city. Numerous attempts by the Guild to manage it had failed. "The fleet is a blight, Thorne," Burnett declared during one of their meetings, his usual charm replaced by a frown of genuine concern. "It sickens our citizens and shames our city. Pennington and his Guild cronies have tinkered for years to no avail. If your Vandermeer principles could offer a genuine, lasting solution to cleanse the fleet, or at least control its effluence, the political and social rewards would be immense." This was a problem of a different order of magnitude than even the Rotherhithe defences. It involved not just controlling water, but managing waste, understanding complex urban hydraulics, and navigating a labyrinth of existing structures and property rights. Alara was daunted, but also exhilarated. She spent weeks poring over old city maps, studying accounts of past failed attempts, and developing a radical new concept, a series of underground brick-lined conduits and settling tanks, combined with strategically placed flushing gates linked to the Thames's tidal flow. It was, in essence, a rudimentary but comprehensive sewage and drainage system, decades ahead of its time. Presenting this to Thorne, she saw a flicker of his old skepticism. Underground conduits, Ilara? Brick-lined. The cost. The disruption. Collier will have an apoplexy. He'll say we're trying to bury the city's problems instead of solving them. We are trying to channel them, Master Thorne, Ilara argued, her passion evident. To control what cannot be wholly eliminated. The current methods are merely cosmetic. This addresses the root cause. And think of the health benefits, the reduction in disease. Thorne eventually was convinced by the sheer engineering elegance and potential public good. The Vandermeer proposal for the rationalization of the Fleet River, as Burnett later dubbed it, was even more audacious than their previous endeavours. When Burnett, with his customary political skill, introduced it to the council, it caused an uproar. Pennington denounced it as fantastical, ruinously expensive, and an affront to common sense. Collier declared it structurally impossible and a danger to the foundations of the city. The battle for the fleet would be their greatest yet. Ilara knew that this project, if approved and successful, would truly reshape London, but it would also draw even more intense scrutiny to the mysterious Vandermeer principles and their sole interpreter. The shadows around her were growing deeper, but so too was the potential for her light to, however indirectly, illuminate the city she loved. The ink stains on her fingers seemed to represent not just her hidden work, but the very lifeblood of London she was now attempting to purify. Current part characters, 4,000. Total characters, 14,700 and 9987. The debate over the rationalization of the Fleet River raged for months. Consigliere Pennington used every political lever at his disposal to discredit the proposal. He organised petitions from concerned property owners fearing disruption, commissioned damning reports from guild-allied surveyors predicting catastrophic subsidence, and spread rumours that Thorne's Flemish master was, in fact, a dabbler in dangerous foreign sorcery. Edgar Collier, in turn, launched a technical assault, presenting seemingly irrefutable calculations, which Ilara, on reviewing them via Thorne, quickly identified as deliberately flawed or based on outdated assumptions, to prove the structural impossibility of the underground conduit system. He painted a lurid picture of collapsing streets and buildings swallowed by the earth. Lord Burnett, however, was a formidable political gamesman. He countered Pennington's fear-mongering with carefully crafted public assurances, highlighting the project's potential to eradicate disease and beautify the city. He organised his own cohort of supportive merchants and aldermen, those who stood to benefit from cleaner air and more valuable property along the fleet's current blighted course. Against Collier's technical attacks, he deployed Master Thorne, armed with Ilara's meticulous counter-calculations and brilliantly conceived models that demonstrated the conduit's strength and the innovative soil stabilization techniques she had designed. Ilara worked in a fever pitch. Each new objection, each fabricated risk, required an immediate, irrefutable response. She developed new methods for illustrating stress dynamics in subterranean structures, devised ingenious ways to construct the conduits in sections to minimize disruption, and even designed a new type of ventilated manhole cover, a detail that particularly impressed a group of sanitation-conscious aldermen when Thorne presented it as a Vandermeer subtlety. She developed new methods for illustrating stress dynamics in subterranean structures, devised ingenious ways to construct the conduits in sections to minimize disruption, and even designed a new type of ventilated manhole cover, a detail that particularly impressed a group of Babtha. The turning point came unexpectedly. A prolonged summer drought, followed by a sudden torrential downpour, caused the Fleet River to burst its banks with unprecedented ferocity. Its noxious waters flooded homes and businesses far beyond its usual reach, causing widespread misery and a fresh outbreak of fever. The Guild's existing emergency measures proved utterly useless. The crisis was a stark public demonstration of the inadequacy of the current system. In the aftermath, public opinion swung decisively. The abstract fears stoked by Pennington seemed trivial compared to the tangible reality of the fleet's devastation. Lord Burnett seized the moment. "Gentlemen," he addressed a chastened city council, "we have seen the consequence of inaction, of adherence to outdated methods. Master Thorne's proposal, however bold, offers a genuine solution, a chance to finally tame this scourge. Are we to condemn our citizens to suffer further, or shall we embrace a vision that promises health, safety, and progress?" His rhetoric, combined with the fresh memory of the flood, was irresistible. The rationalization of the Fleet River was approved, though with numerous caveats and oversight committees stacked with individuals whose skepticism was only slightly dented. The project was a behemoth, far exceeding the Rotherhithe works in scale and complexity. It required a massive workforce, intricate coordination, and constant problem-solving. Alara, as the unseen chief engineer, was stretched to her limits. She designed specialized digging equipment, planned complex tunneling routes beneath existing structures, and devised systems for managing the enormous quantities of excavated earth and diverted water. Thorne, now a figure of considerable public authority, though still an enigma, managed the vast undertaking with a competence that surprised even himself. He had fully internalized Ilara's methods, her way of thinking, and could now often anticipate her solutions or even extrapolate from the Vandermeer principles on his own for minor on-site adjustments. He always, however, deferred to her on major strategic decisions, their clandestine consultations continuing with unwavering regularity. The work was dangerous. There were collapses in unstable soil, unexpected encounters with ancient foundations, and the ever-present risk of disease from the fetid river. Alara felt a profound responsibility for the lives of the workmen, her designs always prioritizing safety alongside efficiency, often adding redundant supports or alternative escape routes that the Guild might have deemed extravagant. One day, Silas, Collier's former apprentice, who had, surprisingly, applied for and been given a junior surveyor's position on the fleet project, perhaps out of genuine interest, or perhaps still on Collier's orders to find fault, approached Thorne with a genuine concern. He had noticed anomalous readings in a section of tunnel being excavated near the ancient Ludgate. His own calculations suggested a high risk of subsidence that could affect the gatehouse itself. Thorne, initially dismissive of anything originating from a Collier associate, was about to brush him off. But Ilara, who had access to Thorne's daily site reports, which included Silas's meticulous, if often overly critical, observations, had already flagged the Ludgate section as a potential concern in her own notes. She had been working on a preemptive reinforcement plan. "Hear him out, Master Thorne," Ilara urged in their next private meeting. "His raw data, even if his interpretations are sometimes flawed, can be valuable. Dismissing genuine warnings out of prejudice is a luxury we cannot afford on a project of this scale." Reluctantly, Thorne listened to Silas, and as Silas laid out his findings, Thorne began to see the echoes of Alara's own earlier private concerns. He realized the young man, for all his past allegiances, possessed a sharp engineering mind. Working from Alara's preemptive designs, which she quickly adapted based on Silas's more detailed on-site readings, Thorne implemented a series of deep, angled shorings and grout injections that stabilized the ground around Ludgate. Working from Alara's preemptive designs, which she quickly adapted based on Silas's more detailed on-site readings, Thorne implemented a series of deep, angled shorings and grout injections that stabilized the ground around Ella. A potential disaster was averted, not by the grand Vandermeer principles alone, but by a combination of Alara's foresight and Silas's unexpected diligence. The incident had an unforeseen consequence. Silas, seeing his concerns validated and his calculations contribute to a successful solution, for which Thorne publicly gave him measured credit, a masterstroke of diplomacy suggested by Alara, began to view Thorne and the mysterious principles with a newfound, if still cautious, respect. His reports to Collier became less about finding fault and more about the genuine engineering challenges and innovative solutions being employed. Collier, frustrated by the lack of incriminating evidence, began to suspect his former apprentice was going native. Alara, meanwhile, felt a strange sense of connection to Silas, this young man on the other side who, like her, possessed an engineering mind struggling to be recognized. Perhaps, she mused, talent could bridge even the divides of guild loyalty and gender prejudice if given the slightest chance. But such thoughts were fleeting. The Fleet project demanded her full attention, a relentless, consuming giant that was slowly, painstakingly transforming the very heart of London, all under the invisible guidance of her ink-stained hands. Years passed. The Fleet River project, a monumental undertaking that reshaped a significant portion of London, was nearing completion. The once fetid open sewer was now largely contained within Ilara's ingeniously designed underground conduits. Parks and new, cleaner streets began to appear where noxious marshland had once festered. Public health in the surrounding wards demonstrably improved. Master Thorn was lauded as a civic hero, the tamer of the fleet, his name, and that of his mythical mentor Vandermeer, spoken with reverence. Lord Burnett, as the project's political champion, consolidated his power, becoming one of the most influential figures in the city. Ilara, now approaching her late 30s, watched these transformations with a complex mixture of pride and poignant anonymity. She had, in secret, altered the landscape and the well-being of her city more profoundly than any woman in its history. Her attic room was filled with scrolls detailing not just the Fleet and Rotherhithe projects, but countless other smaller, unheralded innovations. Improved grain mill mechanisms, more efficient dockside cranes, even preliminary designs for a more rational street lighting system using focused oil lamps. Her mind was a repository of London's potential future. The intense collaboration on the Fleet project had subtly changed her relationship with Master Thorn. He was no longer just a conduit or a figurehead. He had become a genuine intellectual partner, a trusted confidant, the only person in the world who truly understood the scope and source of her genius. He, in turn, treated her not as an assistant, but as his peer, his master, even. The pretense of the Vandermeer principles was maintained for the outside world, but between them there was only the shared truth of their extraordinary partnership. Silas, the former apprentice, had also risen. His diligence and genuine engineering aptitude, nurtured by Thorn, who, at Ilara's urging, had taken the young man under his wing after the Ludgate incident, had made him an invaluable site manager on the later stages of the Fleet project. He never questioned the Vandermeer principles directly, but Ilara sometimes saw a knowing look in his eyes when he discussed a particularly elegant solution with Thorn, a look that suggested he suspected more than he let on about the true source of the innovations. He never questioned the Vandermeer principles directly, but Ilara sometimes saw a knowing look in his eyes when he discussed a particularly elegant solution with Thorn, a look that suggested he suspected more than he let on about the true source of the unknown. A silent, respectful understanding seemed to exist between him and Ilara, even though they rarely interacted directly and never spoke of her true role. Consigliere Pennington, though his public influence had waned somewhat with the undeniable success of the Fleet project, remained a powerful, brooding presence. He had never accepted Thorn's miraculous transformation and remained convinced that some deception, some hidden influence was at play. He watched, and he waited. The climax of Ilara's hidden career and its greatest crisis arrived not with a bang, but with a creeping, insidious threat. A series of unusually dry years was followed by a winter of unprecedented frost. The ground, frozen solid to a great depth, prevented meltwater from seeping away. Then, a sudden, warm southerly wind brought days of torrential rain. The Thames, already swollen, began to rise at an alarming rate, not just from the tide, but from the massive influx of meltwater and rainwater from upriver. London was facing a flood of a magnitude not seen in generations, a great flood that threatened to overwhelm not just the newly protected areas, but the entire city. The Rotherhithe defences, Ilara's first major project, held firm. The Fleet conduits designed for just such deluges channeled astonishing volumes of water away, but the sheer scale of the floodwaters was terrifying. Older sections of the city, those still reliant on ancient piecemeal defences, were quickly inundated. Panic began to spread. The Lord Mayor convened an emergency council. Master Thorn was summoned, as was Edgar Collier, still titular head of the Engineers' Guild, though much diminished, and Consigliere Pennington. Lord Burnett, naturally, was at the heart of the crisis management. "Master Thorn," the Lord Mayor said, his face grim, "your new defences are performing admirably. But the old city walls, the northern embankments, they are failing. The water is still rising. What can be done?" Collier, flustered, proposed a series of desperate, last-ditch sandbagging operations, methods that Thorn and Elara knew would be like trying to hold back the ocean with a teacup. Pennington, ever the Cassandra, spoke of divine judgment and the folly of relying on newfangled contraptions. Thorn, pale but resolute, knew this was beyond even the scope of the Vandermeer principles, as he had presented them. The city needed a coordinated, city-wide strategy, something Elara had, in her private studies of London's overall topography and vulnerabilities, actually sketched out years before. A contingency plan for a catastrophic flood, involving the strategic breaching of certain lesser embankments to relieve pressure on critical structures, the emergency elevation of key thoroughfares, and a system for rapidly evacuating the most vulnerable areas. It was a plan of breathtaking scope and complexity, far too radical to have ever been proposed in normal times. He knew he could not present this as his own. It was too vast, too detailed, too far beyond even the expanded reputation he now held. And there was no time for the usual clandestine process of Elara preparing him. The city was hours, perhaps minutes, from disaster. In the council chamber, as Collier dithered and Pennington pontificated, Thorn made a decision that would change everything. "My lords," Thorn announced, his voice cutting through the noise, "the Vandermeer principles have served us well for specific challenges, but this is a threat to London itself. The solutions I have offered thus far, they are not solely my own, nor solely Vandermeer's." A stunned silence fell upon the chamber. Collier's jaw dropped. Pennington leaned forward, his eyes gleaming. Lord Burnett stared at Thorn, a look of alarm dawning on his face. "For years," Thorn continued, his voice ringing with a conviction that came from a truth long held secret, "I have had the honour of collaborating with another mind, a mind of such brilliance, such foresight in matters of engineering and civic planning, that I, and indeed Vandermeer himself, are but students in its presence." He paused, taking a deep breath. "This crisis requires that mind to speak directly. The architect of the Rotherhithe defences, the true designer of the fleet rationalisation, the only person who possesses a viable strategy to save this city now, is not I. It is Mistress Elara Vance, of Cheapside." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by a gasp from one of the aldermen. Elara Vance? A mercer's daughter? It was unthinkable. Pennington was the first to recover. "Preposterous," he boomed. "Thorn, have you taken leave of your senses? A woman? You would risk London's fate on the ramblings of some amateur female scribbler?" Collier, for once, was speechless, simply staring in disbelief. Lord Burnett looked ashen. He knew. He had long suspected the full extent of Elara's involvement, but to have it declared so publicly in such a crisis. "I have her comprehensive contingency plan for a city-wide flood of this magnitude right here," Thorn said, pulling a familiar ink-stained scroll from his satchel. Elara's meticulously detailed emergency proposal, which she had pressed upon him months ago, just in case. He had long suspected the full extent of Elara's involvement, but to have it declared so publicly in such a crisis, "I have her comprehensive contingency plan for a city-wide flood of this magnitude right here," Thorn said, pulling a familiar, ink-stained scroll from his satchel. Elara's meticulously detailed emergency proposal, which he laid it on the table. "It is our only hope. And she is the only one who can explain its immediate implementation. I suggest you summon her, now." The Lord Mayor, desperate, looked from Thorn's resolute face to the damning scroll, then to the horrified expressions of his council. The city was drowning. Tradition, guild authority, even gender prejudice suddenly seemed like unaffordable luxuries. "Fetch this, Mistress Vance," he commanded, his voice barely a whisper. "At once. Current part characters, 4,000. Total characters, 5 and 5 of 987. Elara was in her attic room, a map of London spread before her, tracing the inexorable advance of the floodwaters reported by messengers, her mind a maelstrom of calculations and desperate contingency plans when the summons came. It was not a polite request, but an urgent, almost frantic demand from the Lord Mayor himself, delivered by a mud-splattered, rain-soaked city guardsman. Her mother was aghast. "Elara, To the Guildhall, in this storm. It's unseemly. What could they possibly want with you? Her father, however, looked at Elara with a dawning understanding, a mixture of fear and a strange, hesitant pride. Go, daughter, he said quietly. It seems London has need of you. Of all of you. Wrapped in a heavy cloak, her most crucial scrolls clutched in an oilskin pouch, Elara was escorted through the chaotic, rain-lashed streets. Water swirled around her ankles. The air was filled with the shouts of panicked citizens, the rumble of distant collapses, and the relentless roar of the rising Thames. It was a city on the brink. The Guildhall Council chamber was a scene of barely controlled chaos. Aldermen shouted, messengers ran in and out, and the faces of the city's leaders were etched with fear and indecision. When Elara entered, veiled as was her habit in public, a hush fell. All eyes turned to her, a mixture of disbelief, hostility, and desperate hope. Consigliere Pennington stepped forward, his face a mask of contempt. So this is the saviour Master Thorne proposes? A woman, to lecture us on managing a deluge that baffles the finest male engineers in the kingdom? Elara ignored him. She walked directly to the head table, where the Lord Mayor sat, looking utterly overwhelmed. Beside him, Master Thorne gave her a single encouraging nod. Lord Burnett watched her, his expression unreadable, a complex calculation in his eyes. "My Lord Mayor," Elara said, her voice, though quiet, carrying clearly in the sudden silence. She did not remove her veil. Let them deal with her mind, not her face, not her gender. Master Thorne speaks the truth. I have a plan. It is radical. It will require immediate, coordinated action, and some parts of it will be unpalatable. But I believe it is the only way to prevent the catastrophic loss of the city's heart. She unrolled her master flood contingency map on the table, its lines and annotations stark and clear even in the flickering lamplight. For the next hour she spoke. She explained the hydrodynamics of the converging floodwaters, the critical stress points on the existing defences, the areas that must be sacrificed to save others. She detailed her plan for strategic breaches in lesser embankments to create controlled spillways, the rapid construction of temporary levees along key north-south thoroughfares to channel the worst of the flow, the organisation of citizen brigades for evacuation and emergency works. She detailed her plan for strategic breaches in lesser embankments to create controlled spillways, the rapid construction of temporary levees along key north-south thoroughfares to channel the worst of the flow, the organisation of citizen theatres. Her voice was calm, authoritative, filled with the irrefutable logic of her calculations. She answered questions, deflected challenges, and painted a clear, if grim, picture of the choices before them. Edgar Collier attempted to interject with technical objections, but Elara, without raising her voice, dismantled his arguments with a precision that left him stammering. Pennington fumed about the arrogance and impropriety, but the sheer intellectual force of her presentation, the undeniable grasp of the vast and complex problem, began to sway the desperate men around the table. They were faced with a choice: cling to their prejudices and watch London drown, or trust this unbelievable veiled woman whose mind seemed to see solutions where they saw only disaster. Lord Burnett was the first to break. "My Lord Mayor," he said, his voice decisive, "I have had occasion to witness the efficacy of the underlying principles at Rotherhithe and in the Fleet. The logic is compelling. In this extremity, we must consider all viable options, regardless of their origin." His support, however pragmatic, was crucial. Master Thorne added his own weight. "I have worked alongside the author of this plan for years. I trust her judgment, her calculations, implicitly, more than I trust my own or any other in this city." Slowly, grudgingly, faced with the terrifying reality of the rising waters and the undeniable coherence of Elara's strategy, the council yielded. The Lord Mayor, his face a mask of desperation, looked at Elara. "Mistress Vance, if we grant you this authority, can you truly save London?" "I can give London its best chance, my lord," Elara replied steadily, "but it will require every resource you can command, and the unwavering will to make difficult, immediate decisions. There is no time for doubt or delay." "Then proceed, Mistress Vance," the Lord Mayor declared, a note of finality in his voice. "You have the Council's authority. May God have mercy on us all." For the next 48 hours, Elara Vance, the mercer's daughter from Cheapside, became the de facto chief engineer of a drowning city. From a makeshift command centre established in a drier upper chamber of the Guildhall, she directed the desperate battle against the flood. Thorne was her tireless first lieutenant, translating her strategic commands into operational orders for the work crews. Lord Burnet used his political clout to commandeer resources, conscript labour, and enforce evacuation orders. Even Silas, drawn into the vortex, found himself leading a team of surveyors, relaying crucial data on water levels and structural integrity directly to Alara's command centre. She was everywhere, yet nowhere. Her directives, clear and precise, flowed out. She ordered the controlled breach of the old Lambeth embankment, a heartbreaking but necessary sacrifice that eased the pressure on the vulnerable Westminster sector. She orchestrated the construction of a massive temporary levee along Fleet Street, turning it into a channel to divert water from the ancient city core. She seemed to anticipate every shift in the river's fury, every new weak point, her mind a dynamic map of the unfolding crisis. There were failures, moments of despair. A section of the old northern wall collapsed despite their efforts, flooding a poor district. But overall, her strategy began to work. The rise of the waters in the city's heart slowed, then halted, then almost imperceptibly began to recede. When the worst was finally over, days later, London was battered, bruised, and waterlogged, but its core, its ancient heart, had survived. The Great Flood of 1495, as it would come to be known, had been a catastrophe, but not the utter devastation it might have been. In the exhausted aftermath, as the city began to bail out and count its losses, a strange new reality began to dawn. The veiled woman who had appeared from nowhere and directed the salvation of London was no longer a mere topic of rumour or disbelief. She was a fact. Her name, Alara Vance, was spoken in awed whispers in the streets, in the taverns, in the very halls of power she had so recently commanded. The shadows that had concealed her for so long had been, by the sheer force of crisis and her own undeniable genius, irrevocably breached. The question now was, what would London, and Alara herself, do with this new blinding light? Current part characters, 4,000. Total characters, 5,999 and 87. The immediate aftermath of the Great Flood was a period of stunned recovery and quiet recalibration. Alara, having shed her veil in the relentless, practical urgency of the Crisis Command Centre, found herself an object of unprecedented curiosity and, from many quarters, profound gratitude. The common folk, whose homes and livelihoods had been saved by her interventions, spoke of her with an almost mythical reverence. The Lady of the Waters, some called her. The city's elite, however, had a more complex reaction. While few could deny the effectiveness of her actions, the implications of a woman, and a commoner at that, wielding such authority and demonstrating such superior intellect, were deeply unsettling to the established order. Consigliere Pennington, though publicly silenced by the overwhelming success of Alara's strategy, worked tirelessly behind the scenes to mitigate her influence. He argued in council that while Mistress Vance had shown commendable ingenuity in an unprecedented crisis, it was an anomaly, a desperate measure for desperate times. He insisted that the governance of the city's engineering and public works must now return to qualified guild-approved men. Edgar Collier, his own guild's inadequacies brutally exposed, was more circumspect but equally determined to reclaim lost ground. He grudgingly acknowledged Alara's unconventional insights, but stressed the need for her methods to be properly documented and integrated into established guild practices by certified masters. The subtext was clear. Her knowledge, if valuable, must be appropriated and controlled by them. Lord Burnet, ever the pragmatist, saw both opportunity and risk. Alara was now a public figure, a powerful symbol. He could no longer use her as a completely secret weapon. He quickly positioned himself as her enlightened patron, the one who had long recognized her unique talents. He championed the creation of a new, temporary special commission for riverine reconstruction and future flood defence, with Master Thorne as its titular head, but with a clear, if unofficial, understanding that Mistress Vance would be its guiding intellect. It was a way to legitimize her continued involvement while still maintaining a semblance of traditional structure. Alara herself felt adrift. The intense focus of the flood crisis had been replaced by a bewildering new landscape of public scrutiny and political maneuvering. She was invited to address learned societies, a shocking departure from tradition, consulted by aldermen, and even received a carefully worded letter of commendation from a secretary of King Henry VII, who, while prizing results, was no doubt discomfited by their unorthodox source. Her family was in turmoil. Her mother, Lady Agnes, was torn between horror at Ilara's public notoriety and a dawning, bewildered pride. Her father, Thomas, was quietly awestruck, his earlier silent complicity now transformed into open admiration, though tinged with anxiety for her future. "The world is not yet ready for you, Ilara," he said one evening. "Be wary. Envy is a powerful poison." The most significant change was in Ilara's own perception of herself and her possibilities. The veil, both literal and metaphorical, had been torn away. She had tasted the power of direct action, of open command, and the deep satisfaction of seeing her intellect fully and publicly engaged for the good of her city. The thought of returning to a life of purely clandestine work, of whispering her ideas through male intermediaries, now felt impossibly constraining. Master Thorn, her steadfast ally, urged caution. "They will try to absorb you, Ilara, or to diminish you," he warned. The Vandermeer principles were a useful fiction. But Ilara Vance, the woman engineer, they do not yet know how to categorize you, and what men cannot categorize, they often seek to control or destroy. The Special Commission, under Thorn's nominal leadership, began its work. Ilara, now with a small, dedicated team that included a surprisingly loyal and capable Silas, who had become her unspoken admirer and technical assistant, threw herself into the monumental task of designing permanent, city-wide flood defences, drawing on the lessons of the Great Flood. Her plans were bolder, more integrated than anything London had ever conceived. But Pennington and Collier were not idle. They launched a campaign of subtle obstruction. Funding for the commission was mysteriously delayed. Access to guild-controlled resources and craftsmen was made difficult. Rumours began to circulate that Ilara's flood strategy had caused unnecessary damage in certain sacrificed areas, that her true expertise lay in theoretical scribblings, not practical construction, that her public prominence was an affront to natural order. Ilara realized she was facing a new kind of battle, not against the river's power, but against the ingrained prejudices and entrenched interests of men who felt their world threatened. Her intellect, her calculations, her engineering prowess were not enough. She needed political acumen, alliances, and a resilience that went beyond solving technical problems. Lord Burnet, seeing his own influence tied to the Commission's success, fought many of these battles for her in the council chambers, but he also made it clear that there were limits to how much he could shield her if she became too disruptive. "You have shown London what you can do, Ilara," he told her in a private meeting. "Now you must learn to navigate the currents of its gratitude and its fear. They admire the miracle, but they are uneasy with the miracle worker, especially one in your guise." One evening, Ilara was reviewing plans for a new Thames barrier concept, a series of massive, maneuverable gates far downriver, a truly revolutionary idea that would protect the entire upper estuary. It was her most audacious vision yet. As she worked, she realized the ink stains on her fingers were no longer just a private symbol. They were a public statement, whether she intended it or not. She had stepped out of the shadows. The question was whether London would allow her to remain in the light, or try to force her back into the obscurity it deemed her proper place. Her greatest engineering challenge, she was beginning to understand, was not the taming of a river, but the reshaping of a society's perception of what a woman could be and achieve. The blueprints for that were far more complex, and the resistance far more deeply entrenched. The resistance to Ilara's continued influence took a more insidious turn. Consigliere Pennington, unable to discredit her engineering competence directly after the Great Flood, shifted his attack. He began to subtly question her character, her ambition, her unfeminine assertiveness. Whispers circulated in the city's influential circles. Was it proper for an unmarried woman to hold such sway, to be closeted for hours with men like Master Thorn or Lord Burnet, discussing matters no lady should comprehend? Was her brilliance entirely natural, or did it hint at other, less wholesome influences? Edgar Collier, meanwhile, adopted a strategy of feigned cooperation. He publicly lauded the valuable insights gleaned from the flood response, but insisted that all future large-scale public works must be executed under the rigorous quality control and established protocols of the Engineers Guild. He proposed that Ilara's designs be submitted to a guild review panel for standardization and practical refinement, a clear attempt to appropriate her work and dilute her direct control. Ilara found herself increasingly isolated. While the common people still revered her, and Thorn and Silas remained fiercely loyal, many in the city's establishment who had praised her in the immediate aftermath of the flood now grew cooler, more distant. Lord Burnett, while still supportive, became more cautious, urging her to moderate her public profile and work more collaboratively with the existing structures. He was a politician, and the shifting winds of elite opinion were not lost on him. The breaking point came with Ilara's proposal for the Thames Barrier. It was a visionary project, promising unprecedented long-term protection for London, but it was also hugely expensive and technologically daunting, far beyond anything previously attempted. Pennington seized on it as proof of Ilara's megalomania and reckless disregard for the city's coffers. Collier dismissed it as an engineer's fantasy, impractical and unbuildable with current methods. A powerful coalition formed against her, entrenched guild interests, conservative council members fearing cost and disruption, and those simply discomfited by a woman wielding such intellectual authority. They argued that London had survived the Great Flood. Ilara's emergency measures, now made permanent and improved by Thorn's commission, were sufficient. The Grand Barrier was an unnecessary extravagance, a monument to one woman's ambition. The debate in the City Council was fierce. Ilara, allowed to present her proposal, but not to vote or directly engage in the political horse trading, defended her vision with her usual clarity and irrefutable logic. She presented hydrological models, structural analyses, and long-term economic projections, demonstrating the barrier's ultimate value in preventing future catastrophic losses. "My lords," she concluded, her voice steady despite the open hostility from some quarters, "this is not about ambition. It is about foresight. The Thames is a living entity. It will test us again. We can choose to react, to rebuild, as we have always done, or we can choose to anticipate, to protect, to secure London's future for generations. The choice, as always, is yours, but the river will not wait for indecision." But logic this time was not enough. Pennington's appeals to fiscal conservatism and Collier's casting of doubt on its feasibility resonated with a council weary of crisis and wary of radical change. Lord Burnett, seeing the tide turning decisively against the barrier, made a pragmatic choice. He argued for a phased approach, focusing on further strengthening existing upriver defences, many based on Ilara's earlier designs, and deferring consideration of the more ambitious downriver proposals until such time as technologies are more proven and finances more favourable. It was a political sidestep, effectively shelving Ilara's grandest vision. The Thames Barrier proposal was defeated. For Ilara it was a bitter blow, not just for the project itself, but for what it represented, the limits of reason against entrenched prejudice and political expediency. She had saved their city, yet they balked at her vision for its ultimate security, retreating into the familiar comforts of compromise and caution. In the weeks that followed, the Special Commission for Riverine Reconstruction found its mandate subtly curtailed, its funding for new research restricted. Thorn was still respected, but the dynamic energy that Ilara had brought was being deliberately dampened. She was still consulted, still revered by some, but her direct influence on major policy was being systematically eroded. They had used her genius in their hour of need, and now, with the crisis past, they sought to put that genius back in its proper, less threatening place. One evening, Master Thorn found Ilara in her attic room, not bent over diagrams, but staring out at the London skyline, a profound weariness in her expression. The ink stains on her fingers seemed faded. "They do not understand, Ilara," Thorn said gently. "Or perhaps they understand too well, and it frightens them." "It is not their fear that grieves me, Master Thorn," Ilara replied, her voice low. "It is their short-sightedness. The river will rise again, and they will have chosen to be merely reactive." "Your work is not lost, Ilara," Thorn insisted. "The fleet, Rotherhithe, the emergency defences, London is safer, healthier, because of you. That is a legacy no council can vote away." Perhaps, she said, a flicker of her old spirit returning. But a legacy unseen is a lesson unlearned by those who most need to learn it. She turned from the window, a new resolve hardening in her eyes. If they will not build the barrier, then I will ensure the knowledge of how to build it. Why it is necessary is not lost. If they will not listen to my voice, perhaps they will one day read my words. She picked up a fresh quill. The grand public projects might be stalled by politics and prejudice, but her mind, her intellect, remained her own sovereign territory. She could still design, still calculate, still document. She began to meticulously collate her designs, her theories, her calculations for the Thames Barrier, for advanced sanitation systems, for rational urban planning, not as proposals for immediate action, but as a comprehensive treatise, a legacy of thought for a future that might be more receptive. She began to meticulously collate her designs, her theories, her calculations for the Thames Barrier, for advanced sanitation systems, for rational urban planning, not as proposals for immediate action, but as a comprehensive ray. The Vandermeer Principles had been a fiction to open doors. Now she would create the Vance Principles, a testament to her own undeniable truth. Even if it was a truth, she might have to commit to paper in the quiet solitude of her attic, awaiting a more enlightened age. The battle for London's physical defences might have reached an impasse, but the battle for her intellectual legacy was one she was determined not to lose. Elara dedicated herself to her treatise with the same fierce intensity she had brought to saving London. Her attic room became a scriptorium, filled with meticulously drawn diagrams, complex calculations, and eloquent prose, detailing her engineering philosophy and her visions for a more resilient, rational city. She wrote not for contemporary acclaim, which she knew would be denied her, but for posterity, for a time when a woman's intellect might be judged on its merits, not her gender. Master Thorne became her first reader, her sounding board. He marvelled at the scope and depth of her work. "This, Elara," he said one day, holding a newly completed chapter on harmonic dampening in large-scale flood barriers, "this is more than engineering. This is a new way of seeing the city, of understanding its relationship with nature and with itself." Silas, now a respected junior engineer in his own right, though still facing resistance from the Guild Old Guard, also became a discreet confidant. Elara, recognizing his genuine talent and open mind, began to share some of her less radical, more immediately applicable ideas with him, trusting him to introduce them into the system where he could, without attribution to her. It was a small, indirect way of continuing to influence the city's development. Silas, understanding the unspoken arrangement, became a quiet champion of these innovative new approaches, never revealing their true source, but fighting for their implementation with a dedication that mirrored Elara's own. Lord Burnet, aware of Elara's withdrawal from the direct political fray, occasionally sought her counsel on highly specific technical matters, always with the utmost discretion. He knew her genius was too valuable to lose entirely, even if public association was now problematic. Their relationship remained one of complex pragmatism, a silent acknowledgement of past collaborations and future, if limited, possibilities. He was a man who always kept his options open. Consigliere Pennington and Edgar Collier, meanwhile, believing they had successfully neutralized Elara's direct influence, focused on reasserting guild authority over all public works. They initiated projects, often based on diluted or misunderstood versions of Elara's earlier successful designs, which were frequently plagued by delays, cost overruns, and an overall lack of the innovative spark that had characterized her work. London, while safer than before the Great Flood, was not progressing towards the kind of integrated, resilient future Elara had envisioned. Years turned into a decade. Elara, now in her late 40s, remained unmarried, a spinster by society's definition, but in reality a woman wedded to her work, her intellectual pursuits her truest companions. Her treatise grew, volume by volume, a silent monument to a thwarted yet indomitable ambition. She found a quiet satisfaction in this new form of creation, a sense that even if her grandest projects remained unbuilt, her thoughts, her knowledge, would endure. One crisp autumn morning, a delegation of Dutch engineers arrived in London. They had come to study the city's renowned flood defences, particularly the successful Rotherhithe embankments and the legendary taming of the Fleet River. which had become subjects of discussion in engineering circles across the Channel, largely through accounts carried by merchants and travellers. They sought out Master Thorne, the famed interpreter of the Vandermeer principles. Thorne, now elderly but still sharp, received them with his usual gruff courtesy. He explained the principles, showed them the models, and toured the sites. The Dutch engineers were deeply impressed, particularly by the underlying mathematical rigour and the holistic approach to river management. Master Thorne, said their leader, a distinguished engineer named Van Dyck, "These Vandermeer principles are truly revolutionary. We have nothing quite like them in Amsterdam, though we face similar challenges with water. This Vandermeer, he must have been a giant among men. It is a tragedy his full works were lost for so long." Thorne listened, a faint, enigmatic smile playing on his lips. Later that day he sought out Alara. "They came, Alara," he said. "The Dutch, they see the truth of the work. They called Vandermeer a giant." Alara looked up from her scrolls, a similar faint smile touching her own lips. "Perhaps, Master Thorne, a giant's work can be recognized, even if the giant herself remains in the shadows." "They wish to study the principles further," Thorne continued. "They have asked for any available documentation, any theoretical underpinnings. They believe these ideas could transform water management across the Low Countries." Alara was silent for a moment. Her treatise was not yet complete, and it was written in English for an English posterity. But the thought of her ideas taking root elsewhere, of benefiting other cities, other peoples, even if her name remained unknown, it held a certain appeal. "There are some foundational monographs," she said carefully. "Early explorations of the core concepts which I prepared for Master Vandermeer's supposed archives. Perhaps those could be rediscovered and shared, if transcribed into a more universal scholarly Latin." Thorne understood. It was another layer of artifice, but one that would allow her knowledge to spread, to find fertile ground where it might be valued for its own sake. "I will see to it," he said. "Silas is proficient in Latin. He can assist with the transcription. It will be Vandermeer's final gift to the world, through his humble interpreter." And so, sections of Alara Vance's genius, disguised as the lost wisdom of a fictional Flemish master, began to travel beyond England's shores. Her ideas, unburdened by the prejudice attached to her name and gender in her own land, started to influence the very real engineering practices of other nations. Alara continued her work on her great treatise, a quiet scholar in her Cheapside attic. She never achieved the public recognition or the authority that her talents deserved in her own lifetime in London. The Thames Barrier remained an unbuilt dream, but her impact on the city was undeniable, etched into its embankments, its conduits, its improved health and safety. And now her thoughts, her principles, were taking wing, anonymous but potent, to shape other landscapes, other futures. She had learned that legacy could take many forms. Sometimes it was built in stone and iron, visible to all. And sometimes it was written in ink, on hidden scrolls, a quiet intellectual current flowing beneath the surface of history, waiting for the moment, or the mind, that would bring it fully into the light. The ink stains on her fingers were a testament to both the seen and the unseen, the realized and the potential. And in that, Alara Vance found a profound, if solitary, peace. Her story was not one of overt triumph over the prejudices of her age, but of an enduring, transformative intellectual resilience that would, in ways she could not yet fully imagine, outlast them all. Several more years slipped by. Master Thorne, frail but still mentally acute, passed away peacefully in his sleep. His death was marked with quiet respect in the city. The tamer of the fleet was laid to rest, his mythical collaborator Vandermeer now truly a figure of historical legend. Alara felt his loss keenly. He had been her staunchest ally, her gruff mentor, her partner in the grand deception that had allowed her genius to flourish, however indirectly. With his passing, one of the last living links to the full truth of her contributions was gone. Silas, now a senior engineer in his own right, continued to champion sound engineering principles, subtly incorporating many of Alara's ideas into his own work and designs. He never spoke of her direct influence, but he would occasionally visit her, ostensibly to discuss complex historical engineering problems, and they would spend hours in her attic room, poring over diagrams, their shared passion for the discipline a silent bond between them. He became the discreet custodian of some of her monographs, ensuring their careful preservation. Lord Burnet, older and more powerful, still a dominant figure in London politics, never forgot Ilara. Though their direct collaboration had ceased, he would sometimes send her anonymous gifts, rare books on mathematics or mechanics, a beautifully crafted set of drafting tools. It was his way of acknowledging an old, invaluable, and still useful debt. He knew her treatise was in progress, and perhaps he even suspected its potential future significance. A man like Burnet always looked to the long game. Consigliere Pennington also aged, his conservatism hardening into a brittle obstinacy. He never ceased to believe that Thorne's successes had been due to some guild-betraying chicanery, but with Thorne gone, his suspicions lacked a clear target. He simply became a general impediment to any new or innovative public works, a monument to the enduring power of reactionary thought. Ilara, now well into her 50s, continued her quiet life, her great treatise, her constant companion. The urgency that had driven her during the crises had softened into a deep, scholarly dedication. She was no longer fighting daily battles against prejudice or incompetence. She was building a different kind of edifice, one of knowledge, meticulously constructed, designed to last. One blustery March day, a young scholar from Oxford, a specialist in the then nascent field of natural philosophy and engineering history, arrived in London. He had been studying the remarkable improvements to London's infrastructure over the past decades and had become fascinated by the almost legendary Van der Meer principles, cited in various city records and in the correspondence of the late Master Thorne, which he had gained access to. He was particularly intrigued by the rediscovered monographs that had influenced Dutch engineering. His research led him inevitably to Silas, who was now overseeing the maintenance of the fleet conduits and the Rotherhithe defences. The scholar, a bright, earnest young man named Arthur Crichton, peppered Silas with questions about Thorne, Van der Meer, and the practical application of the principles. Silas, ever discreet, spoke glowingly of Thorne's genius and the profound wisdom of Van der Meer. But Crichton, a meticulous researcher, noted inconsistencies, anachronisms in the supposed 15th-century Flemish texts, and a certain conceptual leap in the principles that seemed almost too modern, too integrated for their purported fragmented origin. "There is a coherence, a singular vision to these principles, Master Silas," Crichton mused one afternoon as they stood overlooking the now clean and orderly banks of the former fleet. "It speaks less of recovered fragments and more of a single, extraordinary mind, working systematically." Silas met his gaze. He knew Crichton was close to a truth that could still be dangerous, or at least deeply embarrassing to the city establishment. But he also saw in Crichton a genuine seeker of knowledge, not a scandalmonger. "Master Thorne," Silas said carefully, "was a man of great intellectual humility. He always attributed his insights to his master, Van der Meer. Perhaps Van der Meer's genius was simply so comprehensive that it appears as a single vision, even when filtered through Thorne's interpretations." Crichton was not entirely convinced, but he lacked any concrete evidence to challenge the accepted narrative. He continued his research, collecting anecdotes, studying plans, trying to piece together the puzzle of London's engineering miracle. His inquiries eventually led him to hear whispers of a reclusive Cheapside lady, a Mistress Vance, known in her youth for some unusual intellectual pursuits, and a connection to the late Master Thorne. Most dismissed these as idle gossip, the fanciful imaginings of a woman who had perhaps assisted Thorne with minor clerical work. But Crichton, with a scholar's instinct for the overlooked detail, felt a pull. He sought out Ilara, presenting himself at her family's home. Lady Agnes, now elderly, was flustered by the appearance of an Oxford scholar asking for her spinster daughter. But Ilara, intrigued by his carefully worded letter of introduction, mentioning his research into Master Thorne and the Van der Meer principles, agreed to see him. They met in the Vance family's rarely used parlour, a room far removed from the intellectual ferment of her attic. Crichton, expecting perhaps a faded eccentric amateur, was unprepared for the quiet intensity in Ilara's eyes, the precision of her language when he spoke of engineering concepts. He outlined his research, his admiration for the principles, and his lingering questions about their true origin and coherence. Ilara listened patiently, her expression unreadable. She spoke of Master Thorne's great skills, of her own modest assistance in organising his papers in his later years. She confirmed the existence of the Van der Meer monographs, even showing him a carefully transcribed Latin copy of one, prepared years ago by Silas. She was courteous, intelligent, but revealed nothing of her true role. Crichton, though charmed by her intellect, left feeling that a crucial piece of the puzzle was still missing. He sensed a depth, a comprehensive understanding in Mistress Vance that went far beyond that of a mere organiser of papers. But he had no proof, only a scholar's intuition. As he was leaving, Elara said, almost as an afterthought, "Mr. Crichton, if your studies of historical engineering continue, you might find that true innovation often arises not from grand singular pronouncements, but from the persistent, often unseen, accretion of careful observation, meticulous calculation, and a deep understanding of first principles. Sometimes the most profound rivers flow underground for a very long time before they emerge into the light." Her words stayed with him, an unseen accretion. Underground rivers. Was she speaking of Van der Meer, or something more? Elara returned to her attic, to her treatise. She knew Crichton was intelligent, perceptive. Perhaps one day he, or someone like him, would piece together the full truth. Or perhaps not. It no longer mattered to her in the same way it once had. Her legacy was not in public acclaim, but in the enduring strength of her work, both built and written, and in the quiet confidence that true brilliance, like a river, would eventually find its course, whether its source was immediately visible or remained for a time, a deeply held secret of the earth. The important thing was that the river flowed, and that it nourished the land through which it passed. Current part characters 4,000. Total characters 7,587. Arthur Crichton's visit, though inconclusive for him, had an unexpected effect on Elara. It was a reminder that the world beyond her attic, beyond even London, was beginning to engage with the ideas she had birthed. The thought that her Van der Meer principles, even under their false attribution, were stimulating new thought, new research, brought her a quiet, profound satisfaction. It affirmed her decision to commit her life's work to paper. Her great treatise, now titled Principia Fluviana et Urbana, a rational foundation for civic engineering, was nearing completion. It was a monumental work, encompassing hydrodynamics, structural mechanics, sanitation engineering, urban planning, and even a section on the logistical management of large-scale public works. It was dense, rigorous, and filled with innovative concepts, all supported by meticulous calculations and detailed diagrams. It was, in essence, the sum of her life's intellectual journey. She knew it could not be published under her own name in the current climate. Even if a printer dared, the guilds and conservative elements in the city would decry it. But she wanted it preserved, accessible to future generations who might be more receptive. She discussed it with Silas, now her most trusted confidant in such matters. Silas, whose own career had been quietly but significantly shaped by her unseen guidance, understood its importance. "This is a cathedral of knowledge, Elara," he said, awestruck, after reviewing a near-final draft. He had long since dropped the formal Mistress Vance in their private discussions. It must not be lost, but how to ensure its survival and its eventual discovery by the right minds. Together they devised a plan. Elara would make 2 meticulously handwritten copies of the Principia. One would remain with her. The other, Silas would discreetly deposit in the library of a small, relatively new and forward-thinking Oxford college, Wadham College, known for its quiet patronage of the sciences and its less rigid adherence to ancient tradition. It would be presented as an anonymous gift, a compendium of advanced engineering theories from an unknown English practitioner, building upon continental principles. The hope was that, in the more scholarly and less politically charged atmosphere of Oxford, it might eventually find readers capable of appreciating its true worth, regardless of its unacknowledged authorship. The task of copying the vast manuscript was arduous, taking Elara many months. Her eyesight was not what it once was, and her fingers, though still nimble, ached from the long hours of writing. But the work was a labour of love, a final act of intellectual midwifery. As she penned the last lines of the second copy, a sense of completion, of peace, settled over her. She had done what she could. Her built works protected London. Her written work, she hoped, would one day enlighten it and perhaps places far beyond. A few years later, Elara Vance, now in her early 60s, fell ill. A persistent cough, a growing weakness. She knew her time was likely drawing to a close. She put her affairs in order, her small personal little estate left to her bewildered but grieving relatives, with a special bequest to Silas, her personal copy of the Principia, along with all her private notes and diagrams, for his scholarly consideration and judicious preservation. Lord Burnet, hearing of her illness, paid a rare private visit. He was an old man himself now, his political triumphs in the past. He sat by her bedside, the former pragmatist, now showing a surprising gentleness. "London owes you a debt it can never truly repay, Elara," he said, his voice subdued, "though it may never fully know the extent of it." Elara smiled faintly. "The river flows, my lord. The city is safer. That is repayment enough. Your principles," Burnet continued, gesturing vaguely, "they have taken root even beyond our shores. I hear talk from my continental contacts. New flood defences in the Netherlands, canal improvements in France, they bear an uncanny resemblance to certain Vandermeer concepts." A flicker of satisfaction lit Elara's eyes. "Ideas, my lord, have a way of finding their own channels, if they are sound." She passed away quietly a few weeks later in her attic room, surrounded by her scrolls and the silent testament of her life's work. Her death was noted in the city records as that of Elara Vance, spinster, daughter of the late Thomas Vance, mercer. There was no mention of her engineering triumphs, no public acknowledgement of the mind that had saved and reshaped London. Silas, with a heavy heart, fulfilled her final wishes. He ensured the anonymous copy of the Principia Fluviana Urbana was safely delivered to Wadham College Library, where it was catalogued and placed on a quiet shelf, one remarkable but unattributed manuscript among many. He kept Elara's personal copy and her notes as his most treasured possession, studying them, learning from them, ensuring her knowledge was not entirely lost to her own city. Decades passed. London continued to grow, to change. The Great Flood of 1495 became a receding memory, its lessons gradually forgotten by new generations of city planners and engineers, who often reverted to older, less effective methods, or implemented piecemeal solutions without understanding the integrated vision that had once protected them. The Thames barrier remained unbuilt, but Elara's intellectual river had not stopped flowing. In Oxford, Arthur Crichton, now a respected professor of natural philosophy, stumbled upon the anonymous Principia in the Wadham Library during his ongoing research. He recognized, with a jolt of scholarly excitement, the same singular, brilliant vision he had sensed years before, the same coherence that had puzzled him in the Vandermeer fragments. The style, the depth, the sheer audacity of the concepts. It was an English mind, he was certain, and one of extraordinary power. The manuscript contained no author's name, but Crichton, remembering his conversation with a certain reclusive Cheapside lady and her enigmatic words about underground rivers, began to suspect. His subsequent research, cross-referencing the Principia with Thorne's surviving notes, which Silas, in his old age, cautiously allowed him to examine, and, with the known timelines of London's great engineering works, began to build an irrefutable case. The Vandermeer principles, the taming of the fleet, the Rotherhithe defences, the master plan that saved London from the Great Flood, they all pointed back to one source, one unseen, unacknowledged intellect. Years later, Professor Arthur Crichton published his groundbreaking work, The Unseen Hand, Elara Vance and the Engineering of Renaissance London. It caused a sensation, then an academic firestorm. It challenged centuries of accepted history, daring to attribute some of London's greatest civic achievements not to famed guildmasters or noble patrons, but to an unknown woman. Initially, there was fierce resistance, disbelief, accusations of scholarly fantasy. But Crichton's meticulous research, the undeniable evidence of the Principia itself, now brought into the full light of scholarly scrutiny, and the corroborating details from Thorne's and Silas's records, gradually won over the skeptics. Elara Vance, long after her death, began to emerge from the shadows of history. Her name started to appear in new histories of engineering, of urban planning, of London itself. The term Vance Principles began to supplant the mythical Vandermeer. Her treatise was studied, debated, recognized for its visionary brilliance. The Thames Barrier, her grandest unbuilt dream, was eventually constructed, centuries later, its design bearing an uncanny, though by then acknowledged, debt to her original concepts. Elara never sought fame in her lifetime. She sought only to apply her intellect for the good of her city, to solve the problems she saw with a clarity few possessed. She had been forced by the prejudices of her age to work in secret, her contributions veiled, her name erased. But true genius, like a powerful river, cannot be dammed forever. It may flow underground for a time, unseen, unheard. But eventually, inevitably, it will find its way to the surface, reshaping the landscape, leaving an indelible mark, a lasting legacy for all time. The ink stains on her fingers had in the end written a story far more enduring than any edifice of stone or iron. They had written her name, indelibly, into the intellectual bedrock of the city she loved. The posthumous recognition of Elara Vance was not a swift or universal embrace. The traditionalists, the inheritors of Pennington's and Collier's mindset, fought a rearguard action for decades. They nitpicked Crichton's research, questioned the authenticity of the Principia, and sought to minimize Elara's role, portraying her as, at best, a gifted amateur who perhaps provided some minor assistance to the true male geniuses of the age. The idea of a woman being the primary architect of such monumental achievements remained, for many, an uncomfortable, almost offensive proposition. But the evidence Crichton had amassed was too compelling, the intellectual power of the Principia too self-evident. Younger generations of scholars and engineers, less bound by the prejudices of the past, began to champion Elara's cause. Societies were formed in her name. Her treatise was translated, annotated, and became a foundational text in the study of historical urban engineering. In the city of London itself, a slow, almost reluctant awakening occurred. Plaques began to appear, discreetly at first, then more prominently, acknowledging her contribution to the Rotherhithe defences, the fleet conduit system, and the strategies that mitigated the Great Flood. A lectureship in civic engineering was endowed in her name at Gresham College. The attic room in Cheapside, though the original Vance house was long gone, became the subject of historical pilgrimages. The irony was not lost on those who studied her life. The woman who had been forced to work in the deepest shadows, whose name was deliberately suppressed, eventually became one of London's most celebrated, if belatedly recognised, civic heroes. The irony was not lost on those who studied her life. The woman who had been forced to work in the deepest shadows, whose name was deliberately suppressed, eventually became one of London's most celebrated, if belatedly recognised, civic heroes. Her story became a cautionary tale about the societal cost of prejudice, about the squandered potential when half of humanity's intellect is dismissed or ignored. Perhaps the most poignant legacy, however, was not in the grand histories or the public monuments, but in the quiet inspiration she provided to others who, like her, found themselves on the margins. Aspiring female scientists, engineers, architects, thinkers, stumbling upon her story, found in Elara Vance a kindred spirit, a testament to the enduring power of intellect and resilience in the face of systemic obstruction. She proved that a single mind armed with knowledge and determination could indeed reshape the world, even if that world was not yet ready to acknowledge it. Arthur Crichton, in his later years, often reflected on Elara's enigmatic words from their only meeting. Sometimes the most profound rivers flow underground for a very long time before they emerge into the light. He had spent his life tracing one such river, and in doing so had not only illuminated the past, but had also perhaps helped to clear the channels for future rivers of talent to flow more freely. Elara's Principia Fluviana et Urbana continued to be studied. Its prescient insights into sustainable urban development, integrated water management, and the importance of designing with nature rather than merely against it found new relevance in later centuries as cities across the globe grappled with environmental challenges she had foreseen with astonishing clarity. Her work was not just a historical artifact. It was a living document, its principles still capable of informing and inspiring. The ink stains on her fingers, the quiet companions of her solitary labours, had faded from her skin long ago. But the ideas they had committed to vellum, the visions they had brought to life, had stained the very fabric of London, and through the subtle diffusion of knowledge, the wider world. Ilara Vance, the mercer's daughter who dared to dream of reshaping a city, had in the end achieved a legacy far more profound and far-reaching than even her ambitious mind might have conceived. She had proven that while societal structures could silence a voice, they could not permanently extinguish the light of a truly brilliant idea, and that light, once kindled, had the power to illuminate centuries.